Chapter 12-13. Why Star Order seemed to be stunned for a moment before he chuckled. You're still pretending? You're not like everyone else. Lionel didn't respond, his gaze having turned a frightening cold. But toward this, wise Star Order only released his first genuine chuckle. He was truly stunned that Lionel had gotten mad at him. If Lionel was mad because he caused him to be harmed as a child, that was fine. In fact, wise Star Order could understand that he would be mad having been outclassed and manipulated as well. As for the fact that Lionel had quite literally been a baby at the time, wise Star Order didn't seem to care. However, Lionel seemed to be enraged by the words wise Star Order had said about his grandmother. To be mad about such a ridiculous thing. Wise Star Order laughed once more. They'll never understand, I really won't. Forget it, this is nothing more than a waste of my time. The tablet glowed and a vague figure emerged from it. It was clear that the reason Lionel hadn't been able to see wise Star Order earlier was because he had been hiding away in the tablet. If the snowy star owl's gaze could see through the tablet so easily, it wouldn't be a sixth-dimensional creature. In fact, it would have to be maybe the most powerful existence in the dimensional verse. However, without the tablet's protection, Lionel could see wise Star Order just fine. And quite frankly, he looked like nothing one might expect. He was a man probably even more handsome than Elther. He exuded a cold aura that could make women swoon, and there was an arrogance in his gaze that looked down on the world. Visit. For the best no understanding experience, his hair was white and flowing, but his gaze was a gentle gold. The individual fibers of his irises layered atop of one another, giving the illusion that one was looking into a nebula lost in the depths of space. Even Lionel had to admit that this was a beautiful man. Maybe a bit too beautiful. As a child of the universe, blessed with the right to become a savant, maybe this was how he should look, though. Wise Star Order took a step through the air, appearing before Lionel in the blink of an eye. The pressure he exuded was enormous. Just with his soul alone, Lionel could feel a depth he couldn't even begin to fathom. There was no doubt that wise Star Order in his current state was most definitely not in the fifth dimension. In fact, Lionel had a feeling that he wasn't in the sixth dimension either. At a minimum, the soul before him was in the lofty seventh dimension, a height that the current Lionel couldn't even grasp toward. The gap was simply enormous. When wise Star Order said that his soul was fragile, that was only a matter of relativity. It didn't matter how fragile a seventh-dimensional soul was. To a fifth-dimensional being, it might as well have been a god ascended beyond a god. And yet, Lionel matched his gaze, a depth of cold detachment within them that seemed unmoved and unbothered. Wise Star Order scanned Lionel from top to bottom. The difference between them was so large that he didn't feel the need to rush. Plus, with how large the gap in their dimensions was, Lionel was indeed correct, he could read Lionel's mind. This didn't have much to do with his ability, but was rather a matter of a gap in dimensions. Reading Lionel was as easy as Lionel could read the pages of a book. This was what a true gap in dimensions represented, a gap that even Lionel couldn't close. Are you confident because of your mother? Your father maybe? I must say that your father is indeed a man I have to fear. Unfortunately. He isn't here, and even he wasn't able to see through the protections of the tablet. As for your mother, she is powerful enough to eradicate the Luxnick single-handedly right now. But she is still within the sixth dimension. What threat does she pose to me? Visit. For the best no understanding experience, wise Star Order said these words and scanned Lionel again. But nothing about his expression changed except for his smile becoming colder. I have over 10 million minds, each thinking different thoughts. You only have one to sift through them all. Those are odds I quite like. How about you? Lionel asked evenly. Wise Star Order's gaze turned colder. You overestimate yourself, young one. If you are so confident, why are you talking so much? Come on and try your luck. Lionel's gaze also became colder. The entire sector was focused on a singular arena hundreds of thousands of miles away from this place. The Luxnick's estate seemed to be quite calm at this moment as well. No one seemed to be aware that a cold war with a weight beyond anything anyone could imagine was occurring right this moment in an inconspicuous temple. And then, wise Star Order smiled brightly, suddenly turning into a beam of light that entered Lionel. Lionel's gaze flashed, his mind steeling itself and activating. He didn't trust his own reaction speed against a seventh-dimensional existence. For all he knew, the gap could be so wide that his mind would wipe instantaneously. As such, he set one of his S to take out the silver tablet and activate its personality wiping function. The instant wise Star Order vanished into his body. It was a moment that occurred in less than a split second. The moment Lionel felt the cool sensation of the silver tablet entering his palms, he knew he had won. Without his personality, Wise Star Order's consciousness would be gone, leaving his soul as nothing more than a ball of energy without form. However, when the tablet flashed and Wise Star Order's soul was targeted, a sudden laughter resonated through Lionel's body. Visit. For the best no_underscore_understanding experience, young one, like I told you before, you truly overestimate yourself. 10 million minds? Did you think that this was a feat? Even with a single mind I can have 10 million thoughts simultaneously and without effort. Scanning all of your thoughts and organizing which were decoys and which were reality was as easy as breathing. Do you think I was unaware of this trump card of yours? Lionel froze, feeling his body losing control of itself. Unfortunately, Lionel had made a great mistake. When Miel erased Ana's personality, he had to wait until she was in a state of absolute vulnerability. Her mind had to practically collapse first. Despite being her father and knowing that Ana would probably trust him to do it normally, he still had to take this approach. What? The answer was simple. The tablet wasn't omnipotent. It couldn't just rush about erasing the minds of people as it pleased. It needed one's guard lowered to the greatest possible degree. A seventh-dimensional expert, 2 evolutions above Lionel and completely on guard, was the exact opposite of the situation Lionel needed. Lionel's gaze flickered, its coldness fading and a sigh leaving his lips. It seems that his lack of information had finally caught up to him. There was only so much that could be done through deduction. The latest _AP_SODIs are on _the website. His luck had run out. Chapter 12:14. Lionel didn't seem to be enraged. It was more so that he had already expected as much. It was an inevitable end. Every day he seemed to be learning about fascinating and great things, but too often these were matters that others were fully aware of, or could have been explained to him long ago. The fact that Wise Star Order mentioned going to seek out a second tablet after he had enough strength was enough to prove that he at least knew something about these matters, enough for him to be ready for everything Lionel was prepared to throw at him. Wise Star Order was correct. Lionel had overestimated himself. 10 million minds sound like a great feat and an enormous number, but one had to remember that the gap between dimensions was akin to the difference between mortals and gods. By the 5th dimension, millions probably shouldn't even be considered a large denomination anymore. The fact that Wise Star Order could treat it like a joke didn't really fill Lionel with humiliation. He just felt inadequate and foolish. Maybe he was an idiot for taking offense to Ana's lack of belief in him. She probably knew far more about the dimensional verse than he did. In that case, her reaction to his dream wasn't cruelty, it was just a dose of reality. The harshest realization of it all was that even if Lionel was correct and 10 million minds was far too much for Wise Star Order to sift through, it wouldn't matter. Even if he had caught Wise Star Order off guard, the silver tablet still wouldn't have been able to wipe his personality. Lionel thought that he might be enraged when he faced death or feel fear in the very least. But he didn't react those ways at all. Rather, it was almost like because he could see the logic behind his death, he could accept it. He didn't know how to feel about this. It was much less dramatic than the last time he almost died. Well, there were multiple of those times, but there were only 2 he could remember that truly felt so close. The second was of course this moment right now, and the first was the day he almost died at the hands of that mine girl. His guilt had reached such a peak at that time that he felt like he deserved to die. In a lot of ways, it was similar to this moment in that he saw the logic in it. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel was rational and logical to a fault, or at least that was the way he liked to see himself. Because of this, he could never understand why some thought themselves to be better than another. There was no objective metric by which you could judge the value of a human being, there were only various lenses you could see worth through. Lionel's talent was seen as oh so valuable in the world he was currently in. But it was exactly just that. Only valuable in the world he was currently in. What if the dimensional verse was absolutely peaceful and they entered a world where battle prowess and the ability to throw the strongest punch was meaningless? Would his perceived value still be the same? In Lionel's mind, unless one could come up with an objective metric by which to value someone, all of this was just worthless. No matter what world you live in, 1 liter of water would remain 1 liter of water. 1 second of time would remain 1 second of time. The wavelength of blue would remain the wavelength of blue. Unless someone could give him the worth of a human with an objective, unadulterated and indelible number, you could never convince Lionel otherwise. Maybe somewhere deep inside, Lionel was fascinated with finding out what this objective metric was. His fascination with crafts, his pursuit of unity and peace, maybe it was all because of this one purpose. But it didn't seem to matter much now. He had finally slipped up. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel sighed. Old man, you really screwed me over this time. Lionel's mind flashed with images of his father before he stopped thinking altogether. He didn't feel like giving Y-Star Order the satisfaction. The only chance he had now was for his dad to realize that he was no longer Lionel. Maybe then he could get revenge from the afterlife. He wasn't mad at his father for not teaching him about the dimensional verse. No matter how much his father knew, there was a limit to his knowledge as well. Eventually, Lionel would run into something his father hadn't taught him, and then what? There was no way anyone could know everything about such a vast world. What would set people apart were those who were either lucky enough to never have to face the unknown, or powerful enough that the unknown didn't matter. Clearly, as lucky as Lionel was in life, he still wasn't lucky enough. And as powerful as he thought he had become, he was still an ant. Lionel relaxed. But what he hadn't expected was for the moment he did, for a shocked scream to ring through his mind. Lionel didn't seem to react to this like one should. He calmly turned his attention toward his ethereal glabella, the location Y-Star Order must have entered, and what he found made him raise an eyebrow. Visit. For the best no-underserved experience, oh I see. Lionel's almost deadpan voice filled Y-Star Order with an almost endless amount of fury. How is this here? How? I made sure to have them take your innate node out of you. Y-Star Order felt himself crumbling away beneath the might of Lionel's seventh star. It swirled about slowly but menacingly, a harsh aura of destruction wafting outward. The moment Lionel was born, Y-Star Order had decided on his vessel. He was absolutely perfect, but the Scarlet Star innate node was too dangerous. It was deadly to practically anyone who came in contact with it, let alone a fragile soul. So, Y-Star Order devised a plan to have it taken out of Lionel. His original intention was to let Lionel grow without it, take over Lionel's body, and then snatch the innate node back from Miguel, thus completing his machinations. After all, there were certain troubles associated with transplanting high-level innate nodes that would act as stumbling blocks for Miguel, slowing his progress enough for Y-Star Order to overtake him with ease even with Lionel as a starting point. However, even with all his vast stores of knowledge, he could have never expected that Lionel would regrow his innate node. How was that even possible? He had traveled so much, seen so much, absorbed so much. But he had never heard of such a thing. Lionel watched as Y-Star Order struggled, his emotions hardly fluctuating. It was like it wasn't his life being saved right this moment at all, almost as though he was watching a movie from a third perspective. He was simply unmoved by it all. Visit. For the best no_vel_underscored_g experience, he didn't feel any happiness or relief. Instead, I guess I really am just lucky. You should have feared my father more. Chapter 12:15. It was quite ironic. Just earlier today, Lionel's grandmother was warning him about the dangers of Scarlet Star Force. Her exact words were that Scarlet Star Force was one of the only forces she knew of that could cause harm to a higher dimensional being while even at a lower dimensional level. However, when faced with Y-Star Order, Lionel hadn't even considered using it. Firstly, whatever damage a force could land required it to actually land in the first place. Lionel had no confidence in landing an attack on a seventh-dimensional being. Y-Star Order had already proven that his mind worked even faster than Lionel's own. It was foolish to even consider such a thing. Secondly, Lionel had still underestimated his own innate node. Even though he remembered the words his grandmother had said, he didn't think that this would apply across two-dimensional levels. Though Lionel had fought sixth-dimensional experts in the past without the use of his Scarlet Star Force, there were multiple factors to take into account. For one, they were exceptionally weak amongst sixth-dimensional beings. Compared to the sixth-dimensional existences of the Luxnix family or seventh-dimensional families, it could only be said that the mere fact they could share the same title was grace enough. The second important point was the environment. Because of the preparations Lionel had made, the core abilities a sixth-dimensional existence should have weren't accessible, thus weakening them further. Visit. For the best no_vel_ed_g experience. Third, Lionel had a detailed breakdown of all of their abilities ahead of time thanks to the detailed report of the radix. With the opportunity to set up a battle plan ahead of time, he was at too great of an advantage. And finally, Lionel's body was built on the foundation of the lineage factor of a pinnacle seventh-dimensional family, and he had brought it to just a single step away from the sixth dimension before the battle even began. Yet even with all of these advantages, that battle had almost cost him his life. Knowing all of this, when faced with a seventh-dimensional existence like Y-Star Order, even Lionel was a bit baffled by the result. This was especially so because Y-Star Order wasn't a normal seventh-dimensional existence. It had to be remembered that savants could not access the strength everyone else could. This meant that they couldn't progress through the dimensions like everyone else could, nor could they comprehend universal forces. This was the exchange they made for the power they were granted. This meant that the seventh-dimensional pressure Lionel was feeling from Y-star order wasn't a result of his true dimension level, but rather a reflection of how much he had honed his ability throughout the years. Visit. For the best no_vil_undershangy experience, Lionel had assumed that because Y-star order's ability was tethered to his soul's mobility and immortality, that it would naturally translate into its durability. And that it did. The issue wasn't durability, but rather durability in comparison to a corporeal body. Why was it that a supposed seventh-dimensional being was forced to bide his time and scheme as he had? Why did he go so far to cover up his ability as a savant, even to the point of fabricating the birth of several Northern Star Orders in order to hide his trail, and even spending an entire lifetime as a Good Samaritan, all to ensure that the maximum number of individuals possible would believe his philosophy? Didn't it all point toward him not being as powerful as he seemed? A savant like Weiss would always be able to protect himself because as he grew, his ability to lock space would continue along with him. What did he have to fear if everyone around him couldn't move? A savant like Candle would always be able to protect herself because as she grew, her ability to reflect attacks would grow along with her. What did she have to fear if every assault levied toward her was reflected back toward her enemy? A savant like Monkey would always be able to protect himself as he grew, his ability to multiply his strength seemingly indefinitely would always grow along with him. What did he have to fear if there seemed to be no end to the strength of his fist and the number of copies of himself he could make? Visit. For a better user experience, all of the savants that Lionel had met to this point had abilities that directly translated to strength or excellent defense, but what would you do when you were a savant like Y-star order? You would, presumably, be born in a family that treasured power. But you could display none of your own in your youth, all you had was your clever mind and a title bestowed to you by a mysterious entity with a purpose you knew nothing of. In that sort of situation, what would you do? Wouldn't you have to bide your time and scheme? Hopping from valuable body to valuable body, strengthening it to reach your goals and then abandoning it before it died of old age? Wouldn't you be forced to do exactly what the current Y-star order had done? But ultimately, your innate disposition would still be fragile and weak. As much as Y-star order had tempered his soul over the years, compared to a true seventh-dimensional existence, it was lacking considerably. While his soul was leaps and bounds above what one could expect from even a seventh-dimensional being's soul, when compared to a seventh-dimensional being's body, it was several steps below. Visit. For a better user experience, the soul was ultimately a fragile construct. Even when supplemented with such a powerful ability, this fact didn't change. In fact, Y-star order's soul was only about as durable as Lionel's body would be once he brought his metal body to the sixth dimension. Y-star order had been a man who took every step meticulously, making sure to cover his bases, had actually fallen to a boy due to bad luck just when all his years of diligent planning were finally about to pay off. Wasn't his life far too meaningless? Chapter 12:16. There was one large matter that still left Lionel deep in thought, though. The soul manipulation ability was more than just about a soul being able to exist without its body for extended periods of time and giving the soul shape. It came with a great boost in intelligence similar to other mental type abilities, came with an enormous boost in soul durability, and, most importantly, came with extraordinarily sensitive senses. Honestly, when Lionel had read the description of the soul manipulation ability index, he had assumed that Tier 5 practically aligned with an indestructible soul. But hearing the screams of pain and agony of Y-star order, even to the point he couldn't even maintain his form properly anymore, Lionel realized that at least that assumption had been wrong. But what about the rest? With the sensitivity of a person with a soul manipulation ability, it should definitely be far beyond Lionel's own. Was it not possible to sense? Lionel actually wasn't sure. He had been walking around with a massive ticking time bomb in his right kidney, but no one had ever said anything about it. In fact, now that he thought about it, his grandmother, who also had senses far beyond himself, warned him to watch out for Miguel. From her words, it was clear that she was also unaware. When Lionel's thoughts led him down this road, he realized there was another person whose ignorance was a bit baffling. Lionel wasn't sure of the abilities of the world spirit, at least not entirely, but he would think that his mother's internal sight was probably pretty powerful as well. But she hadn't said anything about his regrown innate node either. Visit. For the best no_vil_undershangy experience previously, Lionel hadn't linked all of these things because he wasn't aware that regrowing an innate node was so impossible. It was only after he heard Y-Star Order's shock that he put two and two together, finally understanding why his grandmother was so worried. No one but he was aware that he had regrown his node. Even those he fought at Valiant Heart Mountain, back during the last time he had been forced to use it, all died at his hands. I see. Is this a sort of protection? Or is it something else? Y-Star Order didn't even notice that my innate node was back until he ran into my 7th star. He didn't confirm until then. Interesting, eh? Young one. You win. You win. I yield. Lionel, who had tuned out Y-Star Order's screams, raised a brow. Honestly, Lionel wasn't being neglectful. He was ignoring Y-Star Order because there wasn't much he could do in this situation other than observe the status quo. While he could take control of his 7th star to absorb more Scarlet Star Force, he would just end up hurting himself. And quite frankly, Y-Star Order's wisdom was beyond his own. He clearly lived up to his name. This wasn't a man Lionel could just outsmart because he wanted to. Why couldn't you sense my innate node? Visit. For a better user experience, Y-Star Order, who was experiencing the pain of a lifetime, was speechless. What the hell was this little brat asking him right now? But he seemed to want to grasp onto the last strand of hope he had, so he answered. He and Lionel weren't exactly normal people to begin with. Maybe there really was no better time than now for this. I couldn't sense your innate node even if I wanted to. Even now I can't. The only explanation is that it's grown to a point where it will return to nature soon. Return to nature? My innate node will leave me? Lionel blinked, not liking the sound of this. No. Y-Star Order grit his teeth, doing his best not to call Lionel a fucking idiot. Forces on the level of Scarlet Star Force are called true state forces. There are only a few and each represents the greatest pinnacle of a particular element. When it returns to nature, it means that it is in perfect union with its surroundings and is accepted by both your body and the universe. Y-Star Order felt like bashing his head against a wall. The philosophy behind this was deep and complex, but it felt like thousands of drills were twisting into his body at once. How could he focus on this lesson and that at the same time? The appearance of an innate node comes with a phenomena. The more powerful the innate node, the more powerful the phenomena. Usually babies like you die, but your father was powerful enough to protect you, so you lucked out. This phenomena represents the fury of the universe as you are stealing something from it. This punishment is even worse for humans than certain other races. The pinnacle state an individual with an innate node can reach is a return to nature state. That's a stage where your innate node is no longer a foreign object but rather becomes a true part of yourself. Similar to a savant, the burden of usage drastically lowers when such a state is reached. Visit. For a better user experience, the beginning stages of this transition is denoted by a large influx and increased concentration of natural force nodes, and you will begin to hear your force node speak to you. Y-Star Order spoke these words as fast as he could, expelling them almost like hot air. If it wasn't for Lionel's thinking speed, he probably wouldn't have picked up on all of it. Lionel's gaze lit up. That sounds great. Y-Star Order, probably pissed off by Lionel's reactions, just sneered deeply, a cold laughter filling Lionel's mind. I don't know what you did to be approaching such a state so early, but it's not a good thing for you by any stretch of the imagination, especially not with the nature of Scarlet Star Force. At your pace, within 100 years your innate node will return to its natural state. Usually, only those old bastards of the elemental races who've seen tens of thousands of years of life would be able to reach that stage. Their minds are far stronger than yours and their paths have already been set in stone. But you're nothing more than a little brat with a ticking time bomb hovering somewhere within his body. If your innate node returns to nature without you fully comprehending and grasping it, it'll be controlling you, not the other way around. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 12:17. Controlling me? Is just a source of energy. Lionel's brow furrowed. The disdain in Y-Star Order's short silence spoke volumes. However, Lionel waited patiently. After all, it wasn't his soul suffering in infernal hell. Y-Star Order could be as disdainful as he wanted, he didn't care. It's not just a source of energy, fool. Y-Star Order no longer held back. Since he had already acknowledged that Lionel was a lot like him, he also understood that there was no point in holding back. Whether or not he was nice with his words didn't matter. Lionel had already decided whether he would care to listen to his proposal or not. Everything else was meaningless. In the lower dimensions, energy might just be energy. But, the higher the dimension, the more energy gains character of its own. Why do you think universal force relies on comprehension? Why do you think artistic conception can become so powerful? Why is the dividing line between mortality and the God path the unshackling of the mind and the visualization of the fifth dimension? Lower dimensional worlds have no idea where consciousness comes from, they think that it just sprouts up from nowhere. Your Earth is a bit more interesting as it leaned very heavily into science, far better than those primitive third-dimensional worlds that could barely boil water, but even they were lacking. It's not a secret where consciousness comes from, consciousness is birthed from energy. The forces of the dimensional verse all represent certain kernels of truth, certain philosophies, and embody certain values. When a living creature is born, they are the result of an amalgamation of these forces. Life, at its root, is just a random assortment of these vast energies. Who you are as a person is randomly decided by how these energies come together. Visit. For a better user experience, why is it that savants have minds that work so much differently from normal individuals? It's because they are so hyper-talented in one area that we lose the well-roundedness many others have. The result is a fixation on one path and an imbalance in personality that those who can't see the world the way we do find odd and feel a need to fit into a box. Every force in existence has a disposition it slants to. The closer to a true state force you become, the more the weeds are cut away and the more striking a singular powerful thought remains. By now, I'm sure you know exactly what that singular thought for your Scarlet Star force is. Lionel's gaze narrowed. Destruction. Lionel's mind began to piece these things together. So it seemed that when he tried to force the formation of his 10th node, feeling that his body was missing something, he had accidentally caused the accelerated growth of his innate node. Right now, it was much larger and much more powerful than it should have been. Visit. For the best no_vil_undershinji experience Wise Star Order had said it would take 100 years. Lionel didn't know how true or false this was. But, what he did know was that in the grand scheme, 100 years wasn't a lot of time. A sixth-dimensional existence could live for over 500 years without much issue. A seventh-dimensional existence could experience over 1,000 years and live into the several thousands. Lionel wasn't sure about beyond that, but from what it sounded like from Wise Star Order's words, eighth-dimensional existences were indeed real, and they lived on the order of tens of thousands. These numbers didn't become outrageously large to Lionel until the seventh dimension. There were people back on Earth who could live past 200 years old, so it wasn't too much of a culture shock to him below that. It was just that this wasn't the norm for the rest of the dimensional verse. This aside, saying Lionel had 100 years left was like putting a looming guillotine over his head. If his Scarlet Star Force had as much potential as he thought, maybe only the pinnacle of the eighth dimension could compare. There was simply no way Lionel could comprehend anything to that depth in such a short time. Those long lifespans weren't just for show, that was how much time it took even the most gifted to reach those levels. I see, Lionel's gaze sharpened. His feelings about his previous close shave with death practically rolled off his shoulders as though it had never happened. He had already accepted that his luck was a large part of the reason he could stand here today. He wouldn't let his close call force him to waver. In fact, he felt that his mind was firmer and he already wasn't far from Tier 5. He seemed to be blazing through the fifth dimension just as fast as he had the third. Visit. For the best no_understanding experience. I will hear you out and thanks for this information, it's greatly helpful to me. Why should I save you after you tried to kill me instead of waiting until you're weak enough for the silver tablet to work on you? Lionel wasn't entirely sure how it worked, but what he was sure of was the fact that memory and personality were separate thanks to his experience with Aina. That meant that if he used the silver tablet, it shouldn't affect Wise Star Order's memories theoretically. However, as for whether this would allow Lionel to absorb them, Lionel had no idea. It was a nice thought, but he wasn't sure if it was a thought he had had from watching too much anime with his dad or if it was feasible. He also wasn't even sure where he would absorb it. He didn't have a tangible soul with a form like Wise Star Order did. For all he knew, after his personality was erased, Wise Star Order's soul would just slowly dissipate. It might be more feasible if Wise Star Order used Dream Force, which Lionel had an exceptionally high affinity in. But from what it seemed, Wise Star Order used regular Soul Force. There was also the problem of how strong Wise Star Order's soul was. It was definitely far stronger than Lionel's own. Would Lionel's mind implode if he tried to absorb it? Lionel simply knew too little to act. There were far too many variables. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Realizing this was his chance, Wise Star Order pounced on it. I can guide you. Chapter 12:18. Lionel was tempted to probe Y-Star Order by just saying, "Why would I accept that when I can just take your memories for myself?" But he decided against it for the moment. He had no confidence in bluffing Y-Star Order, at least not with something he was so ignorant of. Trying to do so would just put him on the losing end. "Why would I trust any advice you give me? I have a technique." Y-Star Order replied just as quickly, clearly already prepared. "In my travels I've come across a lot. In the race I mentioned born as souls, they have many soul-related techniques. They're called the spirituals. The technique is the technique. It binds the two of our souls into one and ties our fates. So long as one of us dies, the other will as well. This will ensure that I can't harm you." When Lionel heard this, he sneered. "You expect me to believe that you're willing to use this technique? This is essentially you giving up your immortality. Do you take me for an idiot?" If it was anything else, Lionel might have been inclined to believe it initially, but this was too ridiculous. Without Lionel's influence, Y-Star Order was an immortal. If he tied his life and death to Lionel, he was losing an infinite amount of lifespan. Lionel would never believe something so ridiculous. Of course, the other path laid before Y-Star Order was to die right now. But Lionel still felt that this ancestor of his would choose hundreds of paths before he chose this one. Just looking at how scared he was to die even after living for so long spoke volumes. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_ng experience on top of that, the idea of tying his life to someone else disgusted Lionel. He wasn't sure why, but it left him deeply uncomfortable, almost as though he was compromising his sense of self for a person who he didn't even trust. He couldn't explain it beyond this. Y-Star Order furiously shook his head. "There's no such thing as true immortality in this world. Just being in the presence of your Scarlet Star Force is shaving years off of me. At best, I would just live 100 or so times the lifespan of a normal individual of the 8th dimension. I've already lived over 20% of my time through." Lionel's expression didn't change much to this response. He had somewhat expected it. True immortality seemed a bit exaggerated. But even then, Y-Star Order was giving up hundreds of thousands of years. Lionel wouldn't live nearly so long. Seeing that Lionel wasn't biting even after this, Y-Star Order's expression fluttered wildly, being antsy. Every moment he spent here, he lost decades off his life. Even for him, he would soon run out. The destructive capabilities of this force were way too potent. He was right to take precautions against it while Lionel was a baby, but who knew that things would still turn out this way? "All right, sure." Lionel smiled. Unfortunately, before Y-Star Order could get excited, Lionel spoke again. "I will call my dad here and he will inspect your technique in my stead. If he says that there's nothing wrong with it, we can go ahead with your idea." Y-Star Order's expression changed wildly and he began to cough. There's no need to do this, right?" "Why not? It's just a small measure. He's pretty fast, he will probably get here soon. It's not too much of a problem. He's a bit of a dick sometimes, but he's a good father." Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_ng experience, Y-Star Order panicked. "He'll definitely kill me. He won't agree at all. Don't you want to grow on your own outside of your father's shadow? They'll always call you his son unless you can surpass him. Do you have any idea the kind of weight the name Velasco Morales holds?" The agitation in Y-Star Order's voice only seemed to grow. No. I'm actually very okay with being a second-generation wastrel. I've already accepted it. Today my arrogance almost got me killed. I have no intention of going through that again. I have no ambition any longer and I'll just live out the rest of my life in peace, find a beautiful wife, have a few kids. You damned brat. You're messing with me while I'm dying?" Lionel chuckled coldly. "It's you who is playing with your own life. I have all the time in the world. Keep trying to play me for a fool and your sand will run out." Y-Star Order grit his teeth, his fury almost palpable. His soul wavered in and out of existence almost as though it might flicker out completely any moment now. "What do you want?" Y-Star Order squeezed out. "It's simple. I'm sure that among those techniques of yours, there's an enslavement method. I don't doubt it, after all, that's the only reason you'd have so much confidence right now. You probably believe that you'll be able to take control of me one way or another. Visit. For a better _user experience, I want that method. You have hundreds of thousands of years left to live. As for me, even if I make it to the 8th dimension, I will still only have a small fraction of that. If I don't, well, you'll be set free even sooner than that. That's the price. Exchange my lifetime in your servitude and I will let you go. If not, well, rot in hell, ancestor." Lionel's ultimatum was straight to the point and held not a single thing back. He sat in leisure, waiting for Wise Star Order's response. And, surprisingly, it came not too long later. I agree. Good. Smart men don't waste time with meaningless things. Give me the formula for the technique, I will analyze it myself. You won't call that man here, right? I may have been trying to trick you before, but he really would kill me. You, my dad? Lionel laughed. Don't worry, I have methods outside of him to deal with this. Lionel looked at the dictionary in his palm. Visit. For the best no_vil_undersng experience without a word, Wise Star Order began to use the last dregs of his energy to push the technique outward. Chapter 12:19. Lionel took his time. He wasn't trying to torture Wise Star Order, but it was rather that he wouldn't play games with his own life. The technique that Wise Star Order passed on to him was unlike anything Lionel had ever seen before. It almost made all the force art languages that he had learned to this point seem like chicken scratch. Ancestor said that this technique came from the spirituals race. Is the gap this large? His gaze couldn't help but narrow. The difference was akin to going from a coding language filled with redundancies to one that was elegant and streamlined. In fact, what was particularly beautiful about this force art language was that it didn't seem constrained in the same way the others Lionel had come to know were. For example, the Morales family's force art was best used for crafting. The Luxnix family's force art was best used to form beast constructs. However, the force art of the spirituals seemed like it could do it all. It was so perfect that there wasn't a single weakness. After a while, though, Lionel realized that it was just an illusion. It wasn't that this force art language had no weaknesses, it was rather that the weaknesses weren't visible from his perspective and weren't nearly as glaring. It was likely that this force art worked perfectly for specific use cases related to the soul, but Lionel wouldn't be surprised if the spirituals had other languages to deal with other matters. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Lionel couldn't help but be intrigued. He suddenly wanted to know a lot more about this race and how they built their understanding of force arts to this level. Lionel had no intention of switching his force arts. Though this force art system seemed to have no weaknesses and it could perform all sorts of tasks, how well it could do them was a separate matter. It was this that made Lionel realize that the spirituals must have other force arts. But to think that a force art not even created for those purposes could still fulfill them. What about those designed for crafting? How much better are they? The only shame was that Lionel didn't know enough about soul-related matters to understand just how magical this force art language was. To have the ability to tether things as fragile as souls, while simultaneously not causing any harm to them was baffling. Just to understand how great of a feat this was, most humans couldn't even grasp the concept of a soul, even Lionel didn't know where his was or how to sense it. Yet, just by observing this technique, Lionel could feel an odd emotion welling up within him. It was similar to that feeling one got when they stared into the mirror for too long, that feeling that told you that maybe the you that you were looking at wasn't actually you. The more you stared, the more foreign the you had always known seemed, and the more difficult it became to reconcile with the fact that nothing had changed from the moment you started to this moment here. Something stirred within him. First it felt as though he was gazing upon the formation with his eyes. And then it felt like he was gazing upon it with his mind. And then it suddenly felt as though he was gazing upon it with something even deeper than his mind. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel's ethereal glabella stirred, the rotation of his 7 stars becoming faster and faster. Wise Star Order felt like banging his head against a wall. This was his last chance. This stupid fool had actually lost himself in meditation. The force arts of the spirituals were very unique, and Lionel's analysis of it could only, at best, be considered to be about 10 to 20% accurate, with the rest of it being nonsense. The spirituals had a very unique way of protecting their intellectual property and their discoveries. Most outside their race that gaze upon their force arts would feel as though their souls were being ripped out from their bodies. Eventually, exactly that would happen. Then the use of the force art would change and one soul would become entrapped. Once this occurred, they would become nourishment for the force art and breathe life into it, causing a self-destruction sequence of the intelligence to take place. But why was Lionel's soul actually so sturdy? Visit. For a better user experience, son of a bitch, who the hell has dream force affinity this high? Wise Star Order suddenly realized that he really was out of luck this time. He didn't have any more tricks up his sleeve. In order to ensure that Lionel trusted him as much as possible, he had even been forced to give the real deal over. Lionel had managed to sense his soul before the force art could rip it out. And, with his dream force affinity, he could take control of it before anything bad happened. The force art of the spirituals originally didn't have any force within it, it was just a drawing. Only by using the soul of the spectator as fuel could it then self-destruct. Its main design was created to use a meditation trick to fool the ignorant into letting their souls free, but it didn't actually have any strong suction force of its own. Fuck. I hate this kid. Once Lionel grasped the technique properly, he was finished. He wouldn't be able to hide anything from Lionel, and even all his lies would be seen right through. He would be a true slave and there was nothing he could do about it. It was all too infuriating. A slow breath left Lionel's lips. His mind felt so much clearer than it ever had before. Though his number of split minds hadn't increased, his thinking speed felt like it had doubled, making the effectiveness of the split minds he already had increased by at least a fold. The latest _AP_SODIES are on _that website. His gaze sharpened and his understanding of dream force seemed to have jumped forward another measure. Lionel suddenly had little doubt that his simulations would be even more accurate than they had been in the past. Let's begin then. Chapter 12:20. Why Star Order Deflated. As expected, after sensing the fringes of his soul for the first time, Lionel grasped the technique not too long after, especially considering that it wasn't much of a technique, Parisi was a contract. So long as you had the skill to draw the force art, there wasn't much else to it. And the fact that Y Star Order was just a soul and didn't have a body made it even easier, not to mention the fact he was already within Lionel's ethereal glabella. Drawing a force art within his own domain like that made things easy on him. Soon, Y Star Order found himself bound, his mind and thoughts completely opened up to Lionel. The only saving grace about this matter was that he was finally not being continuously assaulted with pain because he could finally leave Lionel's mind. Y Star Order didn't seem to be doing too good. Aside from the fact his expression was dark, he had suffered no small amount of injury and the result was him being nothing but misty fog from the waist down. Even some of his torso got the same treatment. He gazed toward Lionel deeply, but Lionel himself was still a bit enraptured by that mystical feeling this force art had given him. But, unfortunately, it didn't feel nearly as good as the first time. It was like the trick no longer worked on him anymore. Your dream force affinity is abnormal. Y Star Order said coldly. What is abnormal about it? It's just related to my ability. Lionel said casually. No, it's abnormal. Your affinity is what you would expect from a savant, but you're clearly not one. I would bet that you haven't even truly stepped into Tier 4 of your ability, it makes little to no sense. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel raised an eyebrow. He looked up to meet his ancestor's gaze. But then he soon realized that he didn't need to observe him to know whether he was lying or not, their connection told him all he needed to know. It seemed he would have to flex this muscle a bit more because it required him getting a feel for his soul and sensing what it was telling him. It was almost like he had gained a new limb and he needed to learn how to use it. I haven't stepped into Tier 4 of my ability? I thought I had already? Lionel was a bit off-put by this as well. The tier of your ability can't be decided by how it functions in a 5th or 6th dimensional world, what are you thinking? Then is it decided by how it works in a 7th dimensional one? Lionel asked. He hadn't ever felt his ability dip down in strength when going between worlds, so he always just assumed it never would. No fool. Your father was born in a 7th dimensional world. Why would your ability take a dip down in one? The true strength of an ability is decided by how it performs on a void battlefield. A void battlefield? Visit. For the best no_vel_underscore_ng experience, Y Star Order sighed. It seems that this would be his life now. Guiding a literal toddler to learn about things almost anyone would already know about. They're the locations between domains. The pressure they exude is unlike anything you've experienced. Even those born on 8th dimensional worlds cannot take them lightly. From what I can see, your ability would be at best at the lower reaches of Tier 3 on even the weakest void battlefield. In the worst case, it would fall near the higher reaches of Tier 2. Lionel's brow shot up. That was an enormous change. The levels of Lionel's ability were opening, awakening, visualization, control, and finally manifestation. He could still stand it if his ability fell to Tier 3 because visualization was what he probably used the most often. If he fell out of Tier 4, he would lose access to abilities like Dream Counter and Dream Sense, but it wouldn't be the end of the world. Falling out of Tier 3 though. That would be an enormous hit to his battle prowess. Visualization allowed Lionel to recreate objects and simulate reality in his mind. If he lost that, he would lose his Dreamscape, Dream Sculpt, Dream Clone. Practically all of his abilities' best strength would vanish. All Tier 2, The awakening level could give Lionel was an added sensory perception and his Dreamforce affinity. But, because his ability couldn't project Dreamforce like other Dreamforce-related abilities could, this was all but useless. Lionel's expression went through several changes. He had never expected something like this. Visit. For a better user experience, how do I strengthen my ability? Why Star Order really didn't want to answer, but it seemed he didn't really have a choice. Didn't you just take the first step? Comprehend Dreamforce more. That's the root of everything you can do. But you already said my Dreamforce affinity is higher than it should be. Then why would my ability level be so low on a void battlefield? Since when did affinity have anything to do with comprehension? In fact, the higher your affinity, the tougher it makes it in some respects. People like you just do without understanding, and it's a detriment. Lionel almost couldn't help but chuckle at this. The irony was palpable. He spent so long running away from doing things on instinct, and yet he had neglected what he relied on instinct the most to do. From the very beginning, everything related to his ability came naturally to him, and things only got better after he swapped out Soul Force for Dream Force. Now that Lionel was aware, though, the change he had to make was simple. Visit. For the best no_underscored_understand experience, he just had one other pressing question, one that was burning at the back of his mind. He would never forgive himself for not getting an answer to it. How the hell do I stop old bastards like you from reading my mind? I don't like it. And, last chapter for today, love. Chapter 12:21. Lionel and Y Star Order fell into a full-blown back and forth, much to the latter's chagrin. However, there was no escaping it. If he wanted to make his life the smallest bit easier, he had no choice but to follow along with Lionel's wishes. The only way to protect your mind from higher-dimensional beings is by using a higher-dimensional treasure. I don't have a seventh-dimensional treasure just lying around. If I did, would I have almost died to you? Give me a better answer than that. There's no better answer. There's just the answer and nothing else. What do you take me for? I can't just conjure things up out of thin air. Can't you just protect my mind for me? Are you an idiot? Seventh-dimensional existences can tell the difference. You want to expose the fact you have a savant in your head? They'll probably think that you're being controlled by me and they'll kill first and ask questions later. What the hell is this? Didn't you say my dad was OP? Wouldn't these seventh-dimensional old fogies think twice about doing that? What is that supposed to mean? It means overpowered. Then say as much. Are you slow in the head? You can't say words like you mean them and have to abbreviate things? I swear, every generation gets more foolish than the last. Species are supposed to evolve over time, not the opposite. Visit. For the best no_underscored experience, stop changing the subject, old man. Can't you just stick to the topic? It's not my fault you don't understand simple things. The more powerful your father is, the more trouble that brings you. You think people become strong without making enemies? Even if they don't dare to oppose him openly, if they have good enough grounds to target you, they wouldn't hesitate to do so. Something like your mind being taken over by me is more than good enough grounds. Lionel shook his head. Just tell me whether I can use my dad's name to scare people or not. What is wrong with you? Y Star Order was truly speechless. You think I was joking about being a second-generation wastrel? I've been using my dad's status to break the law since I was in middle school. I have no intention of stopping now. That old man must have known, that's why he hid all of this from me. I have too much catching up to do. Y Star Order looked up toward the ceiling and sighed. Why hadn't he realized just how shameless this little bastard was until right this moment? Who the hell said they had law-breaking to catch up on? Where was this young man's dignity and moral compass? If there was any guilt about trying to snatch Lionel's body before, it had all vanished into thin air now. Y Star Order had a feeling that following this boy around would be far more dangerous than all of his previous adventures combined. If you want to get yourself killed, just be sure to release me before that happened. Your father might be able to run rampant in Void Palace as he pleases, but you definitely cannot. Having backing only works if it's actually there. And, from what I understand, the Void Palace selections should still be ongoing right now, and yet you're here. On top of that, there's a golden token in your spatial ring already. That means that your mother just handed it to you without you earning it. If you think that that doesn't come with consequences, you have another thing coming. Lionel chuckled. It really would be his luck to end up like this. Visit. For the best no_underscored experience in all the books and anime he had watched, those with backgrounds always had it easy. How is it that he would end up in trouble because he had one? Where was the justice here? That said, Lionel didn't particularly care. Entering Void Palace was too important. While he hated relying on other people, his parents were an exception. He had been like that since he was young. He wouldn't give most people the time of day, but his mother and his father were too. He would accept the kindness of without batting an eyelash. It was just that his father's kindness had to be taken a bit more forcefully. Never mind all of that. I bet the Luxniks have a treasure that fits the bill though, right? Maybe something in your secret stash? I doubt that you've traveled the world for so long and haven't laid your hands on any treasures for yourself. Why Star Order's lip twitched as he stared daggers at Lionel. He really wanted to say no, but he could already feel Lionel's soul probing him. Finally he spoke through gritted teeth. Yes, I have treasure stores of my own, but there's only one deposit on this planet and the others aren't easy to reach without adequate strength. Also, the one here might be easily accessible, but it's nowhere near as valuable as the other ones. What are you so nervous for? I'll only steal from you when the time comes. Why Star Order's face stiffened. Was this supposed to be a consolation? The question is whether or not this treasure store of yours has what I need or not. If it doesn't, there wouldn't really be much of a point in unearthing it now. Visit. For a better user experience, Wise Star Order took a deep breath. Yes, it should probably have something that's appropriate for your needs. But you really don't need it. So long as you can comprehend more of your innate node, anyone who tries to get a read on you would see nothing but an endless black hole. Didn't you say some nonsense about how there's no better answer before? Now look at you. Lionel stood, shaking his head. Where are you going? Obviously to your treasure store. How long would it take me to be able to grasp my innate node to such a degree? At least a few years. Exactly, now let's go. Wise Star Order almost felt tears falling from his eyes. Was he really going to spend a lifetime being bullied by a junior like this? However, Wise Star Order's terrible mood didn't last for long when his face suddenly brightened up. Ah, you've been found out. Karma really does exist. Visit. For the best no_vil_read_g experience. Lionel's gaze flickered, suddenly feeling several powerful auras converging toward the temple. But then, a light bulb suddenly snapped to life within him and he grinned wildly. What are you laughing for? Come here, ancestor. Let's put on a show. Wise Star Order's face warped. Chapter 12:22. When the Luxniks learned of what happened, they were quite baffled. About 10 minutes after Lionel had passed through the guard and made his way to the temple, the guard in question realized that there was something wrong. The star pendant wasn't something that could be given out casually, and all the times it had been given out had been well documented. There shouldn't have been a situation where a pendant holder was unknown to him as a guard. In fact, the last time the pendant was given out was several decades ago due to matters surrounding that incident. Simply put, no one as young, green or weak as Lionel should have had the pendant in their possession. Of course, a member of the older generation could have handed down their pendant to a junior to make use of this opportunity, and there was nothing necessarily wrong with this as it could be used as the receiver pleased. But something about this matter was still nagging at the guard. For the same logical reasoning as he had concluded previously, he should still know of Lionel. Any descendant prominent enough to be trusted by an elder-level character to such a degree should have been widely known. And the only one with such cachet that he could think of was Miguel. But Lionel was obviously not Miguel, and Miguel had free rein to enter the temple whenever and for however long he pleased. It was already too late for the guard to go after Lionel to question him. He was under strict orders to never step foot in that temple. The secret within was something only the highest echelon of the family would be aware of. Not even all of the Star Order Council were in the know. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Without a choice, he could only report this matter up and hope that he was being too cautious, or if he was truly in the wrong, that the punishment would be lenient. Due to these series of roundabout methods, Lionel ended up spending over a half hour with Wise Star Order, only to find himself surrounded the moment he wanted to step out. However, as shocked as the Luxniks had been that such a faux pas occurred, they were even more so when Lionel strolled out of the front entrance of the temple as though nothing at all had happened. The temple had two entrances. One from the underground city, and the second was the one Miguel had used the night he fought Aina. This entrance was located deep within the furthest reaches of the Luxniks estate and was the most well-protected. All around there were the homes of Star Order elders. Even the Patriarch's personal home could only sit at the outer reaches of this location. So, when several pinnacle sixth-dimensional existences converged onto their most treasured place, ready to face whatever threat had finally unearthed their deepest secrets, even managing to steal a star pendant of their family to complete the final steps. The last thing they expected to see was a young man a fraction of their age walking out with his hands in his pockets. Even if there had been no one there at all, it would have been easier to accept than the result that lay before them now. The elders immediately frowned deeply. The reason was obvious. They could sense a dense Luxnix blood coming from Lionel. With the sharp internal sight their snow force affinity gave them, this was far too easy to pick up on. This sort of density overshadowed even the arm heads of this generation. What was going on? Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel smiled lightly and scanned the crowd. When he landed on a particular older woman, his brows raised. It's you? Sparking Star Order's gaze narrowed. Her mind was sharp even in her old age. Plus, the impression Lionel had left on her wasn't too small, as he was one of the only two to stand up to her aura. Back then she hadn't cared enough to properly scan Lionel, but realizing just how dense his blood was, she couldn't help but be off-put. Sparking Star Order, you know this brat? He should be a member of the branch families. Sparking Star Order started slow before her eyes sharpened. He was invited into the estate by Fluttering Star Order. The atmosphere of the elders completely shifted when they heard this. Though Sparking Star Order didn't elaborate, they all jumped to the conclusion together. Was Fluttering Star Order responsible for Lionel entering the temple? How dare she? Sometimes not saying too much was worth more than laying everything on the table. A conclusion reached personally would always be stronger than one fed to you line by line, especially when the person in question was as biased against Fluttering Star Order as she was. Wrong. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel's voice shook the elders awake, their auras locking onto him with a greater momentum this time. Obviously, they all believed that Lionel was lying to cover for his benefactor. Do you take us for fools? Sparking Star Order sneered. You're wrong. Lionel shook his head. You're saying that I'm lying? That Fluttering Star Order didn't invite you here? That's not what I meant, Lionel yawned. He was a bit tired after finishing his second divine armor, but he hadn't gotten time to rest since then, unfortunately. I mean to say that I'm not a part of your branch family. I was never a part of your branch family. Sparking Star Order's gaze narrowed, not really understanding what Lionel was getting at. Very few had connected Fluttering Star Order's actions to the appearance of Lionel that day. And only one Star Order elder had appeared, so they weren't all familiar with Lionel's face either. But, very soon all of this confusion would be cleared up. Lionel's gaze sharpened and his disposition shifted, a slight violet hue hanging around him. Something about him exuded a heaviness only matched by a lofty mountain range. The latest _IP_SODIs are on _the website. My name is Lionel Morales. Chapter 1223. The pupils of the elders constricted. Ah, you all seem to remember now. Indeed, I was the little baby of back then, the small child you struck from your family records. I have to ask. When you all chose to do that, was that because you were all afraid history wouldn't see you as villainous enough, or is there something I was missing? Lionel's eyes blinked as though he was truly waiting for an answer. However, there obviously wasn't one coming. The elders continued to stare at him, not quite knowing exactly what words they should be speaking right this moment. What are you all wasting time for? Kill him. Sparking Star Order growled. Her cane tapped the ground, sparking flames jetting outward and threatening to swallow everything. The strength she exuded was a striking dichotomy compared to a small and frail body. It was a wonder that in such a small old lady could say such harsh words and even exude such great strength. Wait. An elder known as Layered Star Order stopped her. What are you doing? You need to think about this. If we really kill him, we really will lose Northern Star Order for good. Plus, back then she was already able to kill Snow Star Order and wipe their entire family line out. Even if she hasn't progressed, she isn't someone we can take lightly, and she's already aware of all of our trump cards. You can't just casually kill her grandson because you feel like it. Visit. For a better user experience, Sparking Star Order frowned, but her brows relaxed not soon afterward. How many Northern Star Orders have there been in our history? Sparking Star Order asked. Layered Star Order frowned but still responded. 13? And how many talents on the level of Miguel has there been in that time? Layered Star Order's gaze narrowed. It had to be understood that Miguel's talent was beyond just what was known. There had been a great fanfare around his birth before Lionel overshadowed it, and that was before he gained the root of Lionel's talent. Toward this, though, Lionel's cold aura couldn't help but dispel as he chuckled. See what you did, ancestor? They think the Northern Star Order title is worthless enough for them to just blatantly ignore because of you. Why Star Order rolled his eyes and ignored Lionel completely. He realized winning a war of words with this brat would cost more than he was willing to give. To the Star Order elders, though, Lionel's laughter carried a mocking mirth to it that those with skin much thinner than sparking Star Orders couldn't quite handle. Visit. For a better user experience Miguel's talent? Even if it was great before gaining Lionel's innate node, was it really something to brag about now, especially in front of the person that made it possible? Of course, they had no idea that Lionel wasn't laughing about that at all. As for the matters related to Miguel's talent, he didn't really care, at least he had chosen not to care. If he did, any chance of reconciling with this family would be thrown out of the window. He chose to take satisfaction in forcing them to bow their heads instead. Boy, some things in life just aren't fair. Miguel almost died the last time the innate node was transplanted. If forced to go through it again, you both might really die this time. The risk isn't worth it. In addition, Miguel's base talent cannot be transferred like yours can. The harsh truth is that the current Miguel is far beyond what you would be if you still had your innate node and is a far more worthy investment for the family. If you want to keep your life, I would advise that you stop overestimating yourself. Layered Star Order seemed to be a more neutral order, but he felt that Sparking Star Order's words made sense. What was done and couldn't be undone. In addition, if things were placed in a vacuum, he wasn't wrong either. Lionel with Scarlet Star Force wasn't worth as much as Miguel with it. That was the reality. At the same time, Layered Star Order still lived in a fantasy land where all the greatest powers of the Luxnix could come together. If Northern Star Order and Lionel could just fall in line, not to mention Lionel's mother on top of that, their charge into the 7th dimension wouldn't be impeded. Unfortunately, their planet Luxnix didn't have 7th dimensional potential. They had already cleared all of their zones and reached the peak of their powers. If they wanted to charge into the 7th dimension, they would have to launch an attack on a higher level world. They had to gather as much manpower as they could to accomplish this feat in response, though, Lionel only chuckled some more. This time he really was laughing at the elders before him. However, before they could respond this time he spoke. Visit. For a better user experience, you hear that, ancestor? They don't like your choice in successor. Lionel seemed to speaking to thin air. But, at that moment, the foggy form of Y Star Order formed before the elders could question it for too long. This time, however, Y Star Order wasn't his usual handsome self. Instead, he looked like an old man with a foot in the grave, exuding an ancient aura as he looked down upon his disappointing descendants. Does that mean Ancestor made himself look more handsome than he really was? Y Star Order, who could easily read Lionel's thoughts, almost faltered in the sky. He was a lofty existence who had seen the corners of the universe. Why would he need to make his soul look more handsome? What good was a handsome soul without a body? He really wanted to strangle this brat to death, but he managed to refrain. 3 generations. 3 generations I asked you all to wait. If I didn't return, would you have burned my Luxnix family down to the ground? The pressure of a 7th dimensional being pressed down from above, making the Star Order elders shudder. Y Star Order was just an empty display case, but he was a damn good one. Whether it was his aura or the prestige he had built up over generations, the elders no longer dared to take this matter lightly. I did so much for the benefit of the family that you've even taken it for granted. I will tell you all the truth. In the history of the Luxnix, there has only been a single Northern Star Order, and she was destined to be far more powerful than myself. The remaining stories were all fabricated by me so that our enemies would underestimate the weight these titles held, allowing us to lay low. But, instead of cherishing this opportunity to grow as you should, you've begun to infight and are even whittling down the strength of my Luxnix family. Visit. For a better user experience, how dare you? A strong gust of wind almost pressed the elders to the ground, the rage of Y Star Order feeling so tangible that even Lionel almost thought it was real. It is real, you little bastard. I've never suffered such a loss in my life. Chapter 12:24. Sparking Star Order's expression wavered, his irises trembling. She had never expected such a thing to happen. Of all the situations she could have thought of, this was by far the one most out of left field. The remaining elders were all stunned into silence. It was one thing if Y Star Order was back, but it was another thing entirely for him to be exuding this kind of aura. There was only so much prestige could do for a person without the backing of strength, and there was no greater strength to the Luxnix than the 7th dimension. The truth was that the Luxnix had a few elders primed and ready at the pinnacle of the sixth dimension, prepared to break through under the right circumstances. But none of them had momentum even close to sparking Star Order, and the worst part was that one of them was Lionel's own grandmother. Just when the elders were stuck, not knowing what to do, a violent, all-encompassing aura suddenly descended from the skies. Who dares touch my son? Despite the fact that nothing had happened to Lionel, Eleanor was already enraged, seemingly sensing the volatile atmosphere and easily picking up on both Wise Star Order's aura and what remained of sparking Star Order's flames. Bang! The valiant and overprotective mother crashed down from the skies above, not even caring to slow her descent. The elders found themselves sprawling backward. The only one who was completely unaffected was Lionel himself, as even Wise Star Order found himself been thrown back like a broken ragdoll. It was clear that this wasn't because Lionel was so strong, but rather because Eleanor took special care not to harm him. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Goddammit. Wise Star Order questioned his life choices once again as he was sent flying. What sins had he committed to deserve this? Wise Star Order had hardly finished this thought when he instantly thought of dozens, but in expected fashion he completely ignored these thoughts and kept feeling bad for himself. Eleanor rushed to Lionel, scanning him up and down as though the slightest injury might set her off. Toward such a reaction, Lionel could only chuckle a bit bitterly. Where were you when my ex-girlfriend's dad nearly blasted my head apart like a watermelon? Of course, Lionel would never actually say these words to his mother, considering the concern in her eyes right now. She had only left him for a few hours, believing him to be completely safe since it was rare for individuals to enter the treasure vault, and even if one did, Lionel's presence likely wouldn't be questioned. But who would have thought that Lionel would actually make it all the way here? After cupping Lionel's cheeks for a third time, Eleanor turned a venomous glare toward Wise Star Order, who only just managed to readjust himself. You finally decided to show yourself? Wise Star Order cleared his throat, looking toward Eleanor with an incredulous expression. What was this woman going on about? Visit. For the best no understanding experience, don't try to play ignorant with me. What did you do to my son? I swear if you harmed one hair on his head, I'll make sure that you spend the rest of your life in a fiery pit of hell. Wise Star Order looked toward Lionel, but the latter had rolled his lips over one another, holding back his laugh with as much skill as he could muster. If Eleanor found out how close Lionel had been to death to just now, Wise Star Order really might be finished. Objectively, the reality wasn't all that funny, it almost cost Lionel his life. But even the most terrible things could be amusing in retrospect. This scene was the equivalent of watching a little girl reprimand her grandfather, except 10 times better. How could Lionel not sit back and watch? Plus, it was in Lionel's best interest that his mother didn't over-worry about this matter. Wise Star Order was far more useful with him than he was dead. He had a feeling that his speed of improvement would shoot up like a rocket with this schemer by his side. What? You think we weren't aware that someone was tampering with historical records? My view of the dimensional verse might still have been shallow at the time, but my husband's scope is far larger. If talent on the level of my mother appeared all throughout Luxnix history, there would be no Viola or Montex, and the Luxnix would have entered the 7th dimension long ago. And don't give me bullshit about you doing it for the sake of the family. We're all adults here. So I'll ask you one more time. What did you do to my son? Visit. For the best no understanding experience, Wise Star Order was speechless. Velasco indeed had a deep understanding of the dimensional verse and where talents could fall on a spectrum. After meeting his mother-in-law, he was skeptical that Northern Star Orders had appeared 13 times in their history, so he immediately felt that something was wrong. Unfortunately, Wise Star Order had been correct. Even Velasco had no ability to see through the bronze tablet, so he didn't find Wise Star Order's soul. That said, he still had his suspicions. Still, there was little more he could do than warn his wife and leave behind a fail-safe measure. Eleanor lost her patience, her emerald irises glowing like 2 green flames. Her palm flipped over, a necklace appearing in her hands. Its chain was squeezed between her palm, its pendant dangling in the air before giving off a radiant light. Wise Star Order released a screech. Almost instantly, his body warped, returning to his originally handsome form that left him writhing in pain. But what was most shocking was that within Lionel's ethereal glabella, a second screech resounded and was forcefully ejected from Lionel's forehead. Visit. For the best no underscore experience, Lionel watched on, shaking his head. This sight left him without words. Son of a bitch, the old bastard almost conned me again. Chapter 12:25. How many layers of schemes was that by now? As cautious as Lionel tried to be, he still almost fell for this old man's trap. After so many centuries, millennia even, of scheming, how could Wise Star Order be so simple? First he had tried to gain Lionel's trust by playing the part of amiable elder. When that was seen through, he was prepared to take over Lionel's body in a more forceful way. He then pretended to fall for Lionel's trick when in reality he had read through his junior's thoughts like a book, perfectly countering the ability of the silver tablet. After that, he ran into a roadblock with Lionel's Scarlet Star Force, but rather than giving up there, he tried to trick Lionel into a pact that really would have given him full control over him. Then, when Lionel saw through that, he already had a secondary trap laid with and was waiting for Lionel's soul to be sucked away. By then, Lionel was already 4 or 5 levels deep into Wise Star Order's schemes and felt that he was fine now, especially since he could read his ancestor's mind now. It could be considered an equal exchange. Or so he thought. Lionel had no idea that while he was distracted and meditating upon, getting lost in an all-new world, Wise Star Order's screams in his mind no longer had anything to do with his Scarlet Star Force, but were rather due to his ancestor splitting his soul in two using a technique he had snatched from the spirituals. Lionel executed with one of Wise Star Order's soul, but his second half was completely unfettered. Not only did this allow Wise Star Order to bide his time and wait for an opportunity, due to the oddities of two souls and how they could interact with, Wise Star Order was still able to keep bits and pieces of information hidden away from Lionel. At the same time as all of this was going on, Wise Star Order could slowly build up immunity to Lionel's Scarlet Star Force. With one half of his soul perfectly healthy and the other in perpetual pain, he could use the former half to continuously heal the latter half while using the latter half to deepen his comprehension. The core ability of soul manipulation was the power to allow the soul to adapt to any environment, even if that environment was an entirely new body, and Wise Star Order had been prepared to push this to the absolute limit. If he succeeded, not only would he be able to evolve the durability of his soul to an all-new level, but when he was finished he could still take hold of Lionel's body and no one would be any wiser. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. By that time he would have spent so long observing Lionel that he would know all of his habits, all of his quirks, all of his mannerisms. In addition, the incident with the Luxniks would be so far behind them that even if Velasco or Eleanor suspected anything, it would be unlikely to come back to him. Lionel had never thought that when Wise Star Order shot out of his body with just half his body left that it was because he had split himself. He had assumed that it was because of damage caused by his Scarlet Star Force, but to think he had just been outclassed like that. It was an excellent plan. Lionel couldn't say that he had been outsmarted as he would only consider this to be so if both parties had access to the same information, but he had definitely been outplayed. This ancestor of his was truly an old bastard. But he was a very smart old bastard. Lionel wasn't mad. If anything he was just impressed, wholly so. The tenacity and grit of his ancestor was commendable. Unfortunately. You should have feared my dad more. Lionel shamelessly said these words for the second time that day. But this time Wise Star Order truly roared into the skies, more infuriated than he had ever been before. Hey mom. Visit. For the best no underserved experience Eleanor, who was still enjoying torturing Wise Star Order for daring to scheme against her son, still dropped everything to give Lionel attention. If I wear that necklace he won't be able to mess with my mind, right? Eleanor blinked. That's right. This was crafted by your father. He gave it to me when he visited Void Palace a few months ago. In that case don't kill the old man. He's very useful to me. Eleanor's brow furrowed. Though this necklace worked once, with the scheming nature of Wise Star Order, what guarantee was there that it would be enough next time? For all they knew, he was already scheming something else. I know he's dangerous, but that only makes it better. If I have such a looming guillotine over my head every day, he'll always be on my toes. If one day I never have to fear schemes from him anymore, then whose schemes would I have to fear? Lionel's gaze glowed as he met his mother's eyes. Today could be considered his most humiliating display. Despite the fact his face didn't show it and he seemed quite relaxed and indifferent, smiling even, there had been a fire lit within his belly. Visit. For a better user experience, the dimensional verse seemed to want to remind him just how insignificant he was, just how worthless his accomplishments to this point had been. He had been slapped not just once today, but already too many times to count, each one more resounding than the last. He would never forget this day, he would brand it on his heart. Seeing the look in her son's eye, Eleanor couldn't help but waver. She could normally bulldoze her husband into doing things her way 99% of the time. But whenever he got that look in his eye, that unwavering gaze that met hers and felt as vast as the skies, she knew that no amount of lioness tactics would work. She took a deep breath and lowered her hand, lovingly helping her son to put the chain around his neck. "You must remember to be careful," she said softly. Lionel grinned. "I will." His gaze shifted past his mother, landing on the elders who were still struggling to stand, a deep fear etched into their eyes. None of them could seem to see the depth of Eleanor's strength, it was simply unfathomable. "Tell Miguel that he'll be taking back my innate node on the third day of the selections. I don't particularly need it, but I also don't think I need much of a reason to take back what's mine either. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website." A deep battle intent raged within Lionel. Miguel was his better, huh? Such a thought suddenly pissed him off. Chapter 12:26. There was nothing the Luxniks family could do about it. Eleanor had displayed her strength in the most straightforward way possible, and yet she hadn't spoken a single word. They all suddenly understood just what it meant to be a sector-ranked disciple. Sparking Star Order looked on blankly, her face pale to an extreme. She felt quite hollow, almost as though the hit of her lack of descendants was landing for a second time. "Little Lion, you're really making your mother worry here?" Eleanor wrapped her arms around her son's, her face matching her words quite perfectly. She still felt uncomfortable leaving things like this. When they returned to the Void Palace, although they would both be in the same place, it wouldn't be a simple matter for her to see Lionel. Not only would she have many responsibilities to return to, but the work that would soon be dropped on Lionel's plate wouldn't be small either. Unfortunately, she wasn't her husband. She couldn't move about unhindered in the Void Palace, at least not yet. She was already worried enough about Lionel going over there, but if she had to worry about Star Order as well, it was a bit much. "Mom, visits." For a better user experience, Eleanor's ears perked up, expecting to at least hear words of reassurance. But what she got instead was, "How'd you and Dad meet? I need ammo on the old man." Eleanor was so caught off guard that she sputtered with laughter, forgetting her worry for a moment. It seemed that her son had been poorly influenced by her husband. They were always saying the most ridiculous things with the worst timing. As for Lionel, he was very serious with his question. That old man had spent years making fun of him for how often he had failed to ask Aina out. Then, just recently in the Dimensional Cleanse trial world, Lionel thought he was finally going to get some fatherly advice from his dad, only to find himself on the end of another joke. That said, his dad had said one meaningful thing back then in the midst of laughing at his pain. "You spent 4 years chasing after that little girl, she probably thinks you'll always be there for her whenever it is she wants to come back." That was about the only useful thing he said, and he was probably right. But the old man talked a big game. Lionel wanted to know what sort of pathetic state he really had been. "The first time I met your father wasn't in a setting you would think. He was one of my mentors when I first entered the Void Palace." Visit. For a better user experience, so the old man's a groomer. "This is good stuff, Mom, keep it coming." Lionel was already grinning ear to ear, this start couldn't have been more perfect. He could already think of an endless amount of ammunition from this fact alone. Eleanor laughed. Truthfully, it wasn't like that. The Velasco of back then did indeed purposely flirt with every woman he came across, about as directly opposite to his own son as you could get, but it was the kind of overt flirting that never went anywhere. There were probably a few airheads who took him seriously and fell head over heels, but Eleanor had pretty much ignored him. Our relationship remained like that for years until I became a galaxy-ranked disciple. Back then, your father was in charge of the trips we would take to the void battlefields. As galaxy-ranked disciples, you were obligated to spend at least 3 months of the year on one. Once again, I happened to be under the supervision of your father. I wasn't quite powerful enough to go off on my own like the top geniuses of our rank, unfortunately. Because Earth hadn't underwent its metamorphosis, I didn't have access to my ability, our Emperor's might lineage factor, and most of the strength of the world spirit was still sealed. But those moments allowed me to get to know your father a little bit more. He had always been a lively man and he was able to protect me from a lot of abuses I would have had to suffer otherwise. I was lucky to have him as a protector. Damn it, Mom. Don't get lovey-dovey on me, I need ammo. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Though he thought this, Lionel didn't interrupt. Still, your father and I could only be considered senior and junior at that point. He was too busy chasing skirts and falling asleep in brothels. There were at least 2 or 3 pregnancy scandals going on with him at any given time. The more Eleanor spoke on it, the more fiery her gaze became, almost as though she was thinking about ripping Velasco a new one when next she saw him. Leonel grinned. Excellent, excellent. I could never see your father in that way because of his disposition back then. Trying to change a person is a waste of time. They will change when they feel like it and never a second before. Remember, little lion, when a person shows you who they are, always be sure to believe them. Eleanor looked off into the distance, the peaceful ambience of the Luxnix estate particularly resonating with her right this moment. Leonel gazed down at her side profile, but didn't respond directly to this. He just let it sit in his mind, rolling through his thoughts. Everything changed that day, though. Your father was so furious that the Void Palace realized that the happy and laughing mentor could actually be a madman when he wanted to. The latest _sodies are on the website. Back then, the Void Palace almost fell to its knees. It didn't make much sense. He was a domain disciple, but there were countless elders and old ancestors who had lived so much more life. But it didn't seem to matter to your father. That was the day your grandfather died, and your father's fury dyed the black of the Void Palace red. Chapter 12:27. Leonel sat upon a mountain peak in silence, his conversation with his mother running through his mind. After that event, his father had become a lot more subdued, and it seemed it was his mother who slowly helped him to return to a semblance of his former self. Once that fact settled in, the rest of their story practically wrote itself. The Void Palace experienced Val's fury once. They had no intention of going through it again just to enforce a dated pregnancy rule. In the end, Leonel was born and his father became a much more reserved man. What Leonel cared the most about, though, wasn't the fact his father was such a different man from himself, and it wasn't even about all the ammo he had gotten himself. It was rather about the fact that his father had chosen to aim his blade toward the Void Palace in all his rage. Even without having been there, Leonel didn't need to be a genius to understand. The Void Palace had played a part in his grandfather's death. Leonel's gaze flickered with rage, the dense rock he was sitting upon cracking beneath just the slightest intention. If that was true, he wouldn't mind finishing what his father started. Leo? Leonel blinked several times as though he was scaring his fury away. When he turned back, he found Joel standing there and couldn't help but sigh. Joel had initially thought that Leonel's fury was aimed toward him, but it was clear that this wasn't the case. He plopped down by Leonel's side, handing him a bottle of brown liquid. Even if Leonel had been mad at him, there was no way he would just turn away and leave now. It was precisely the moments where Leonel was acting the most unlike himself that he needed his brothers by his side. Visit. For a better user experience, Leonel looked at it and chuckled. You know I don't drink. Joel smiled. I know, you've always been a pussy in that regard, sipping on your little girl drinks. Hey, there's nothing wrong with a little cosmopolitan in your life from time to time. It's your loss, not mine. Leonel wasn't very surprised that the usually reserved and silent Joel was so vulgar and outgoing in private like this. Joel only spoke like this when it was only the two of them. Whenever the others were there, had always take the role of second in command, his actions serving to amplify Leonel's own. Leonel's shadow was quite a large one to fill. Not everyone could pull off the kind, charismatic leader role that everyone would still follow to the depths of hell well. Most would end up being too nice and lose the edge a ruler should have. So, Joel didn't try to tap dance it at all and only less loose in very rare occasions. Knowing this, Leonel couldn't continue to refuse the bottle and took a swing. But he almost immediately began coughing. What the hell is this shit? Rubbing alcohol? Are you trying to poison me? Joel burst into a fit of laughter. It's good stuff, right? Joel threw his head back, taking 2 deep gulps. Leonel didn't know how he did it. He felt like his whole body was burning from just a single sip. He was really putting his metal body and Scarlet Star Force to shame today. He tried to keep up with Joel, but he found his vision swimming. The fogginess of his mind wasn't something Leonel had experienced before. This was definitely some strong alcohol, definitely fifth dimensional. Who knew how Joel got his hands on it? The latest _sodies are on the website. The two ended up half passed out, staring up at the sky of dusk. The day had waned on them without them even noticing. You know, man? Joel hiccuped. You let things bottle up inside you too much. I've never seen you snap like that. Leonel let out an odd cross of a laugh, cough and wheeze. It seemed like he might hack up a lung. I know. It was embarrassing, right? I didn't even know how to face you guys. There you go again. Why is that your first reaction? Everyone wanted to be there for you. I did something stupid. Everyone does stupid things sometimes. Not me. Never me. It doesn't make sense. None of it makes sense. Lionel didn't even seem to be stringing together coherent thoughts anymore. If he ever remembered this night, he would definitely swear off alcohol. He liked to have full control of his faculties, and he most definitely did not at this moment. Luckily, this was one of the few times he would have such a luxury with his mother watching over him. This might be one of the last times for a long while that he could get to do this. Visit. For a better user experience, not everything has to make sense, idiot, Lionel hiccuped in response. It was hard to tell whether he registered these words or not, but what he did know was that he was very tired. He still hadn't rested since he finished his divine armor, and his head butting with Y's star order hadn't helped in the slightest. If Newton didn't want everything to make sense, we wouldn't have calculus, Lionel eventually said. You think Newton was thinking about calculus when he was boning his wife? He probably would have been better at it, if he did. Joel rolled over, sputtering out a swig he had taken. He coughed out his laughter, half dying and half fighting for his next breath. In his drunken state, Lionel's words were at least 10 times funnier than it should have been, and air seemed to be even harder to get. Only you would say that. Only I'm always right. Well, Mr. Always right. Newton didn't actually have a wife. The man died a virgin. Is that the role model you want? Lionel finally didn't answer immediately. And when he did, he was half asleep. The latest _IP_SODIes are on the website. Fuck. Chapter 12:28. The days passed, and the oddity of the second days of the selections ended just as oddly, with many having not a single clue how things could proceed like this with so many talents absent. However, Orinik and Ganner continued things as though nothing had happened. They simply didn't care. If these people didn't want to participate, it was their loss. This was the Void Palace they were talking about, the strongest organization of the human domain and the location where all of its talents converged. From the beginning, they weren't worried about the talents of this sector very much to begin with. In fact, now that Orinik thought about it, it was quite baffling that that woman would come to oversee things here. Usually, such a high-ranked disciple would never come to such a weak domain, as it was unnecessary. At best, they would usually bring a higher-ranked galaxy-ranked disciple along, but that was all. Orinik didn't think very much about this, though. Despite his usually meticulous and thoughtful disposition, in the years of time he had spent in the Void Palace, with so many young nobles with outstanding backgrounds and greater talent than himself around him, he had learned to not ask questions and mind his own business. In the end, when the third day arrives and many had questions about just what was happening, Orinik didn't care enough to explain things. He simply focused on his task and prepared things as he should, taking with him a list of those he thought deserved to participate. However, he didn't realize just how odd this coming day would be. And maybe odd wasn't enough to describe it. Lionel woke up with a groan, feeling as though his head might implode. It wasn't until after he used dream sense and dulled it considerably that he finally seemed capable of seeing straight once again. But even then, that just gave him a clearer view of the sun shining down at him as though it was some sort of cannon of light. No more alcohol. Never again. Lionel had only just barely woken up when he heard a sputter of laughter. He still hadn't gotten control of all of his faculties, so he assumed he had made a mistake, but when he tried to move, he heard it again. Don't wake up the lovebirds, how could you be so inconsiderate? Visit. For the best no-understanding experience, he woke up on his own. Just look at them. It's like a match made in heaven. I think I'm feeling a little bit jealous. Why hasn't Cap ever cuddled with me like that? His arms wouldn't be able to fit around your fat gut. Aren't you asking for too much? Lionel blinked, not quite understanding what was happening. All he could feel was that burning light in his eye, and his mind was working at least tens of times slower than it normally did. Soon, though, he managed to blink enough that he could get a semblance of a look around. His head tilted and he managed to catch a few silhouettes standing nearby. Suddenly, Lionel heard a light groan and felt a shifting in his arms. At that moment he froze, thinking the worst. He had been so numb to everything that he hadn't even noticed that there was something in his arms. When he looked down, his breath got caught in his throat. I can't. The wheezing laughter broke out like waters rushing through a crack in a dam. The silhouettes fell over in Lionel's eyes, tripping and holding on to one another as they practically hacked up their lungs. Someone tell me you got a picture. The latest _AP_SODIES are on _the website. I took at least 100, but I need more. That dazed look is too perfect, they really look like they're in love. Send it to me, I need it on a t-shirt, I'm never going to forget this moment. I knew Cap never drank because he'd be a terrible drunk, but I didn't expect this out of Joel too. I'm wheezing, I can't breathe. Lionel's lip twitched. The thing in his arms was precisely Joel. The two were coiled on top of one another as though they couldn't bear to let go. The greatest shame was that Joel was still asleep and Lionel couldn't even extricate himself quickly. Damn it, weren't you supposed to be the drinking veteran? How'd you let this happen? It's too much. My stomach hurts, I think I'm gonna die laughing. I've never seen Cap's face so red. Don't worry, Leo. Violet and red is a pretty good combination, you look good. I'm 100% supportive. Women are too complicated anyway, this is a marriage I can get behind. I better be the best man. Let's get purple and red suits to commemorate this day. You. Best man? No one wants to hear whatever cringe speech you'd come up with, I definitely need that. The latest _AP_SODIES are on _the website. Fuck you and you're eloquent now? Guys. There's two of them. You can both be best men. Another chorus of laughter rang out. What was maybe the worst was that even the three Lionel trusted the most had let him down. Arnold, Drake and Alan had lost their way, corrupted by the machinations of Raj, Gil, Milan and Franco. Arnold's face seemed just as stoic as ever, but the amusement in his gaze wasn't something Lionel would miss. Drake had long since covered his mouth, trying to hide his smile. As for Alan, he kept adjusting his glasses as though that would hide the twitching of his lips. Lionel realized at this moment that he'd never be able to live this down. No more alcohol. Never again. I swear. He searched for tears to shed but had none to give. The worst part was that according to his simulation this was because the alcohol had completely dried him out. At that moment, Joel groaned and shifted in his sleep. But he still hadn't woken up, so he just snuggled tighter into Lionel's arms before smiling contentedly. BFT. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 12:29. Lionel had no choice in the matter, he could only take evasive maneuvers. Skip. Laughter rang out toward his back, but he scurried away on a beam of light. His useless accomplice, Joel, still clung onto him for dear life, so he had to do the only thing he could and get rid of dead weight. Joel finally woke up when he hit the ground, looking around in confusion to figure out what was going on, a chorus of laughter becoming his only backdrop. As for Lionel, he had already vanished into the distance and down the mountain. Fuck you guys. Those words echoed from Lionel, but that only made them all laugh harder. A laughter rang out in the middle of nowhere. Lionel laughed harder than he had in a long time, his eyes finally finding the tears it needed. Visit. For the best experience, he wiped them away with a forearm, but the smile on his face didn't seem to have any intention of fading. Hey old bastard, you did that, huh? You're already so ancient, but like pulling these kind of pranks on kids, you're one sick individual. Lionel held the necklace pendant around his neck up to his face. After that day, his mother ended up sealing both halves of Y's Star Order into this pendant. Of course, his mother didn't allow their ancestor to fuse back into one, forcing him to remain in a weakened state with both his halves unable to communicate with the other. And yet, both halves were also now subservient to Lionel. That said, Lionel had learned his lesson already. He would never be too comfortable around this old man, no matter how chains and weights were holding him down. For all he knew, this old man had yet another layer of plans. I have no idea what you're talking about. If you have certain proclivities, don't blame it on me. Y's Star Order spoke indifferently. Yeah. I know it was you. You can't do anything to me, but you can definitely do something to Joel, since I never explicitly said anything other than not harming them. Either way, from now on, no more schemes against my friends. I still have no idea what you're talking about, young one. MHM. Anyway, point me toward that treasure trove. I need to drown out this headache with riches. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. The lip of Y's Star Order twitched. He knew that Lionel was doing this on purpose, but there was nothing he could do about it. The location of the treasure trove was indeed close. Y's Star Order hadn't lied about that. But it was extremely well hidden, so much so that Lionel wasn't surprised that it had never been found. As shameless as Y's Star Order was, he used his own burial ground, taking advantage of the esteem and respect the Luxniks had for him to protect his things. Luckily, Lionel now had just as much free reign in the Luxniks' estate as Miguel did. Now that Lionel thought about it, the second day of the selection had probably already ended and Miguel had likely returned, but the latter hadn't tried to find him. But as far as Lionel was concerned, it didn't matter. There was only one place he could become the third day. Lionel had his own war to fight, and that he did. Entering the treasure trove Y-Star Order was like entering a field of mines. Every corner had danger, and Lionel felt a close shave with death at least 3 separate times, and at least 11 other times, he was almost severely injured and managed to escape by the skin of his teeth. Lionel knew how dangerous it would be, and he had even purposely not used the link between himself and Y-Star Order, making it a true game of back and forth. The fact he was also hungover only made it all the more difficult, but the smile on Lionel's face didn't fade even once. This damned brat, he's a masochist. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Y-Star Order could feel that Lionel was already getting used to his type of thought process. He wasn't outsmarting Y-Star Order, rather he had done a psychological evaluation on his ancestor just based on the small amount of time they had known each other. Lionel then used his conclusions about Y-Star Order's disposition to guess what he would do next and how he would have acted. When Y-Star Order realized this, a cheeky smirk spread across his face. "Little bastard, you want to get a read on me? I've spent thousands of years reforming and reshaping my character time and time again. If you think that this is enough to thwart me, you've got another thing coming." Y-Star Order didn't seem to realize that he had begun to have fun as well. It could only be said that the two men were weird individuals. One was smiling while his life was on the line and the other was grinning as he tried to take the former's life. There was no way anyone could look at such a situation and conclude anything but the fact that they were a pair of madmen. On planet Montex, a familiar young woman sat in the same spot she always had, looking off into the distance as though Lionel's mother was still there. Those around her were a bit worried as she had yet to move since those matters of several days ago, but Savon had also convinced them not to bother her. Things were better like this. After all, between being able to catch a glimpse of her through the terrace window and her locking herself up in her room, this was much better. At least this way they could ensure that she didn't do anything stupid. The days ticked by like this, and on the night before the third selection something seemed to click. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Aina's gaze regained its focus, the moon seeming just a bit brighter and a light smile spreading across her face. She rose to her feet, her hand still clutching onto the amethyst token. Her gaze seemed to radiate a meaningful thank you. As to who it was for, it was, of course, Lionel's mother. She entered the home on the mountain and vanished into the bathroom, leaving Miel, Savon and Yuri a bit at a loss. Chapter 12:30. Lionel took deep and steady breaths, his body beaten and bloodied but a white smile clear beneath it all. He stood at the center of Y-Star Order's treasure trove, his wide grin shining as though it gave off its own light. "All that work and you're actually so poor? You should have told me earlier." Lionel laughed. Y-Star Order's expression darkened. Poor? Even the weakest things he cared enough to keep around were of the pinnacle of the 6th dimension, with the majority being within the 7th. Though it was true that this wasn't anywhere near his best treasure trove, it was more than enough to drown out someone so wet behind the ears. What do you know about wealth? Even the 6th-dimensional things here are very unique and can't be easily found elsewhere. Even among lower-dimensional items, there will always be certain materials rarer than even their higher-dimensional counterparts. What do I know about wealth? Well, do you have anything better than this? Lionel's palm flipped over, revealing a shimmering bow with a string connecting its heads that shone like crystals woven into a fiber. The twin white-maned lions on opposite ends of it seemed to roar to life, exuding a suffocating pressure that blanketed the surroundings. Y-Star Order's next words seemed to become caught in his throat. It wasn't that he had never seen a 7th-dimensional treasure before, or that he hadn't seen one at the pinnacle of the 7th dimension. The issue was, why the hell did this kid have one? It was then that Y-Star Order suddenly realized that Lionel was right. There was nothing here that surpassed this bow in value. In fact, even in terms of rarity, this bow, it was almost unmatched. Y-Star Order could immediately tell that it wasn't a normal Tier 9 gold treasure. But that only made things all the more baffling. Visit. For a better user experience, I bet that if I shot a couple arrows at you using this thing, you wouldn't be able to take it lightly, huh? Y-Star Order's lip twitched, but he seemed to refuse to answer. Lionel laughed again, tallying up 1 point in his favor. Though he had relied on his mom to do so, he finally got one up on this annoying old man. You ignorant little brat, you have no idea what you're holding. That's not a normal bow. Wise Star Order couldn't seem to take it anymore and snapped. Regardless, Lionel would have found out anyway, it was inevitable. What's different about it? Lionel asked. Do you know what's above the gold grade? Lionel fell into his thoughts. Now that he thought about it, he didn't know the answer to that question. But, at the same time, no one could really blame him for being ignorant about it either. To the Lionel of before, the 7th dimension was the highest dimension there was, at least currently. Though he had heard that Earth had 8th dimensional potential as far as he knew, that was a matter for the distant future, since even the Morales, the pinnacle of this world, or so he thought, was only at the 7th dimension. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_g experience using this logic, he didn't think that treasures above the 7th dimension existed. Or even if they did, they were all natural occurrences and there was no one with the skill to forge them into crafts. But it seemed that this wasn't entirely true. What is it? Platinum? Lionel joked. I swear I'm surrounded by idiots. Idiots everywhere. Wise Star Order shook his head. No, above the 7th dimensional gold grade are life-grade weapons. They're living weapons? They have souls? Lionel's lip twitched when he thought of this, remembering how against he was weapons having souls and listening to weapons. He found it to be asinine. If there really was such a thing, it would be more than a little embarrassing. But as soon as Lionel had this thought, he refuted it. If such a thing existed, it would be at the life grade. The spears he was using were still bronze and silver, so how could they have this soul everyone was talking about? At least for now he was still correct. Maybe if the spear domain heirloom had life-grade weapons down the line, he would reconsider his position. But even then he didn't really like the idea of listening to a weapon. No, they're weapons, how could they have souls? Did you flood your head with water? Lionel chuckled but didn't respond. A life-grade weapon is the equivalent of an innate node returning to nature. A weapon is usually fused of many techniques, many ores and many precious resources. When it enters the life grade, there is no longer a separation of the parts that made up the whole. Instead, it all becomes one entity sharing one breath. Visit. For a better user experience, when this happens, the weapon becomes like a natural treasure, no different from a precious metal you might unearth, and it produces its own natural force arts. As a result of this, it becomes a new existence in the world. And, much like how special forces have characteristics of their own, so too would this weapon gain its own. Much like how your Scarlet Star Force embodies destruction and skews your personality, the weapon or treasure will gain its own personality as well, but not in the most obvious, nonsensical sense. But rather in a purer, more subtle sense. Lionel's gaze glowed. Wise Star Order only explained the raw definition to him, but when he thought about how this might translate to crafting, Lionel felt his heart speed up. If he wanted to create a life-grade weapon, what would be necessary? He would have to create a blueprint so perfect, choose materials so immaculate, and draw force arts filled with such unity that it would all blend together without the slightest imperfection. Only then would he be able to breathe life into it. Just the thought made Lionel's blood rush, a certain enlightenment opening up to him. Unknowingly, his skill as a crafter had just taken an enormous step forward just based off a few words. Then, what makes this Tier 9 gold bow so unique? Wise Star Order shook his head. I don't know who was dropped on their head as a baby and decided to give you this weapon, but if you grow in skill enough, this weapon just needs one more push to enter a perfect state of unity and enter the life grade. It's only missing a skilled enough owner. The latest __zodies are on website. Lionel was shocked by these words before he grinned. It seemed his bow was in luck. There was no better master than him. What neither Wise Star Order nor Lionel knew was that the claiming of this bow had caused an enormous storm to kick up in Void Palace. This was a bow that had remained untouched for millennia, as the man who had crafted it was very particular about their wishes for what was to be done with it. But, as the mother lioness does, Alienor didn't follow any of those rules when she snatched it away. Who knew what would happen when others realized it was in Lionel's hands? Chapter 1231. The third day of the selection finally came, and the ambience of the arena was still quite weird and only became more so after Lionel and the people of Earth came. It seemed the fan clubs were still greatly invested into what was happening, because almost the instant Lionel showed his face, a parade of boos rang down from above. It was so deafening that the arena quaked beneath it. Lionel rubbed his nose when he saw that he was receiving such reception. There really wasn't much he could do about it. His own fan club had gone up in smoke. Or rather, they had practically been beaten into submission, then split between the fan clubs that remained. It was a hard world out there for standums and their celebrity heroes. Man, look at that cap. They hate you. Never thought I'd see the day. Raj laughed. Lionel looked over toward Raj and shook his head. True to his word, the man had really gotten a shirt printed out. Lionel didn't even know how he had managed it, but Joel's dark expression spoke volumes. The man was even more quiet than usual. This actually isn't the first time I've been booed like this. Really? Really? I participated in a tournament for the Slayer Legion a few years ago and they hated my guts. Before Lionel could explain more, a strong aura descended from the skies. It was so unexpected that a hushed silence fell over the arena as they all watched a goddess descend from above. Visit. For a better user experience, Ornik and Ganner were in shock. They had just been about to start the proceedings but hadn't expected this at all. They rushed to their feet along with the other envoys, appearing before the angelic woman with their gazes glued to their feet. None of them dared to observe this woman for too long, not to mention the fact that she herself was a demoness they couldn't match up to a single finger of. She was also a sector-ranked disciple and had a husband whose name sent shockwaves through the human domain. Simply put, they liked their lives intact. The third day of the selections will be directed by me. There will only be one battle between my son and an opponent. Yes, your. Orinik was ready to agree, but his words got stuck in his throat. Her son? Who was her son? Was it someone who hadn't participated at all? Suddenly, Orinik's eyes opened wide. It couldn't be a coincidence. Her husband was... And Lionel had. Son of a bitch. The moment Orinik had this thought, he almost fainted. He hoped to God that Alienor couldn't read his mind or else he would be finished. He swore it was a reflexive statement. Really? Visit. For the best no-understanding experience, it was only after Orinik remembered that they were in the same dimension that he calmed down, but even then a cold sweat had already almost drenched him out of his clothing. Alienor didn't pay Orinik and the others any mind. She waved a hand and an unassuming Miguel suddenly found himself on the stage. The envoys quickly retreated, their gazes flickering. Oh, I guess that's my cue. Lionel rose to his feet, strolling toward the center arena. His mother happened to be halfway down his path and she couldn't seem to control herself as she stopped him. She smoothed out his shirt despite knowing that it would likely be ruined quite quickly. Though she wanted to reprimand her son for wearing nothing but sweatpants and a shirt to battle without the slightest hint of an armor in sight, she shook her head and smiled instead, forcing the hearts of all those in attendance to skip a beat. She didn't say any words like be careful or protect yourself. It seemed that for this matter, she was quite confident in her son even if the entirety of the Luxnix estate was not. Off you go. Just when Lionel was about to walk past his mother, he found another silhouette behind her. He realized right then that his mother was actually an accomplice. There was no way he wouldn't have sensed such a thing otherwise, but it was already too late to do much of anything. Visit. For the best no-understanding experience, Aina stood before him with an expression neither too cold nor too warm. It had been a very long time since Lionel had seen her wear a dress, and even given the circumstances, he couldn't help but feel that his breath had been taken away. The gown was a light blue and a white cloth wrapped tightly around her waist. Her slender shoulders glistened with a healthy tan, and Lionel didn't dare to let his gaze linger along her collarbone for too long out of fear for how much further down it might go. And yet, when he instead chose to look up and follow her slender, proud neck, he found the gorgeous painting that was her face. Those golden eyes didn't waver when they met Lionel's gaze, even though his own couldn't help but be flooded with guilt. They say the eyes were the window to the soul, and for Lionel, who was used to keeping his own placid, what once was a clear conscience seemed far more murky now. Aina didn't say anything. Instead, she only flipped over a palm, a bright amethyst token appearing. Lionel was taken aback. Did this mean she didn't accept his apology? Was she still angry? He couldn't blame her. Lionel didn't care what sort of history they had, but he felt like his response to her outpouring was unacceptable. He even felt he let himself down far more than he had let her down. He had done something he was deeply disgusted with himself for. You need this more than I do. The spring breeze of Aina's voice traveled to Lionel's ears, jolting his heart awake. When he saw the small smile that curled her delicate pink lips, his soul seemed to have left his body completely. There's only one man who should lead our sector to the Void Palace. The best man. Visit. For the best no underscore vel underscore it understand G experience, Lionel didn't register when Aina hand grabbed his own and placed the token within it. He didn't register the reaction of everyone around him. He didn't even register when it was that Aina had walked by him and entered the seating section of the Geniuses of Earth. He stood there in a world of his own, the token in his palm feeling heavier than anything he had ever held before. Author's note below. Chapter 1232. Aina's fragrance lingered in the air. Even when Lionel couldn't seem to hear or see anything else, this scent alone was imprinted onto his mind and engraved into his very being. He remembered this scent well. A cross of apple and just the slightest hint of cinnamon. The only way to get the perfect profile of this smell was to use the force herbs he had planted so many of in the segmented cube. But the segmented cube had obviously been with him this entire time, so the only way this would have worked was if she took it with her. Lionel hadn't been to that garden since Aina left. For all he knew, all those force herbs had died, or maybe there wasn't any of them left at all. Scent was probably the sense most capable of triggering memories, and not only that, but it was intertwined with emotions so deeply that they couldn't be divorced from one another. What Lionel did know was that this smell had most definitely not been on Aina that day, or else even with all the foolish rage in the world, he might not have been able to speak those words. What Lionel didn't know was that Aina had only taken a single flower with her, feeling too guilty to justify any more. She had kept it with her all this time and managed to convince herself to finally use it over a year later for this very moment. Lionel's gaze slowly regained its focus, looking down at the amethyst token in his hand. His heart didn't feel the heaviness at all. In fact, even though his hand felt as though it might fall through the earth at any moment, his heart felt as light as a feather and his gaze was as calm as a lake's surface. Aina handed him this token. What did it mean? Lionel felt that it was quite clear. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. She spoke of leading the sector, but the momentum in her gaze was far deeper and vaster than that. She gave Lionel this token, telling him that he needed it more than she did because she knew of his goal. How could the future king of the dimensional verse be subservient to another? Even in his first step toward glory, he should always be at the front, his back in full view of everyone else. Lionel's foot trembled slightly and he seemed to vanish. In an upswell of wind, he landed on the arena just as Aina made it to the seating arrangements of the people of Earth. She smiled gracefully, even bowing her head slightly. Too many were too speechless to say a thing, but Roja didn't seem to miss a beat. "Sweet child, come sit next to Grandma." Roja brought Aina to her side before she could protest, wrapping her arms around hers. Visit. For the best no underscore vel underscore read understand G experience, Meal watched this scene with a dark expression, but there was already nothing else he could do about it. It seemed that his daughter had made her decision, and as furious as he was helpless. Lionel seemed to sense a dense murderous intent that wasn't coming from Miguel at all. His gaze shifted from the amethyst token, sifting through the crowd until it landed on a familiar man, the very man who had almost blown his head to bits with a single punch. His expression didn't change much, nor was there any rage in it. He didn't seem to be angry with Meal at all. In fact, maybe he was a bit thankful. Who knows what else he might have said had he not been snapped out of that state. With a flip of his palm, the amethyst token vanished and a light breath left Lionel's lips. Something about his disposition shifted and the stone beneath his bare feet creaked and whined almost as though his weight had increased tenfold. When he finally looked up to meet Miguel's gaze, the latter was looking back, unmoved. Even after being forcefully teleported to the stage and even after learning of who Lionel's mother was, the needle hadn't budged for him. His expression was even more indifferent than Lionel's own. In fact, there was no coldness either, just a blank wall anything could be painted on. Even after all this time, Lionel couldn't quite get a read on Miguel, at least not as easily as he could seem to grasp others. He was a man of few words and he didn't display any outward emotions. He was about as difficult to read as Lionel would say he was. Visit. For the best no underscore vel underscore read understand G experience, however, Lionel felt he knew enough. This was a young man who sought nothing more than power. He was decisive and unfeeling. He did things at his greatest convenience and didn't care about what harm he caused otherwise. He didn't feel shame not because he couldn't, but rather because he felt he had never done anything shameful. The words and opinions of others were meaningless to him, all that mattered was his own. Lionel knew quite a bit, enough that it was odd that he would say that he still didn't quite have a read on Miguel. But he had his own reasons for saying so. There was a silent lull that took place, a gentle gliding wind riding the silence at an unhurried pace. Orinik didn't dare to start an event that Alienor had proposed, so he sat in silence, feeling that if this was the case, the battle could be considered to have already started. As for the amethyst token in Lionel's hand, he chose not to say a single word about it. Suddenly the two vanished. The sound of stone meeting stone and metal crashing against metal resounded through the skies 3 times, 3 sonic booms and wild outflows of wind jetting forth in their wake. A moment later, Lionel and Miguel appeared where they had always been, the only difference being the turbulent wind around them. Visit. For a better user experience, Miguel was entirely unmoved by an almost blinding streak of scarlet that fell from the corner of Lionel's lips. You are weak, Miguel said plainly. Chapter 1233. Lionel wiped at his blood with a thumb, rolling his shoulders back until he heard a satisfying crack. Beside himself, he released a yawn, stretching his neck from side to side. It seems he was still a bit tired from yesterday, but that couldn't be helped. As for Miguel's words, they were probably true. At least in that exchange he really was the weaker of the two. The envoys of Void Palace couldn't help but frown. The wielder of an amethyst token bleeding was something that had never happened since its inception. Or more accurately, one had never bled during their selection. The entire point of the amethyst token was to represent invincibility, and Lionel was decidedly not that. The rest had dismissed his battle with Isaac, thinking that he was just fooling around. After all, Lionel was a spearman, not a bowman. This made perfect sense considering which family he came from as well. But this was getting harder and harder to accept. It didn't matter that Lionel was in Tier 4 while his opponent was a half-step from the 6th dimension. Invincibility was invincibility. You either were or you weren't. There were no technicalities in real life. Lionel, though, didn't seem to care about the opinions of others. He was just a bit intrigued that Miguel had actually spoken. Oh, is that a justification? Lionel smiled. Justification? Why would I need something like that? Oh. Lionel chuckled. That's not a bad response. Indeed, why would you? And here I thought you were caught up in a few words written long before you were born. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Whether those words have anything to do with me or not is meaningless. If they have nothing to do with me, I will force them to change their minds. If I have no fate with them regardless, then so what? Do I need the legacy of a fool who can't see straight? Lionel erupted into laughter when he heard these words. With each bellow, a stronger and denser violet fog seemed to waft out from him. Beneath its presence, the world itself seemed to slow. I really want to see what expressions that indifferent face of yours can make in defeat. I've never lost a battle in my life, and the first most definitely won't be to you. The two shot forward in unison. This time they took no care to hold back, the entire platform shattering. A surge of cracks raced toward each other from opposite sides of the stage, following the wake of the two young men as though they were speeding to catch up. Bang! Lionel's forearm collided with Miguel's own, the cracks finally catching up to them as they hung in the air for just a fraction of a moment. The ground beneath them sunk and collapsed, forming a pit gained depth before blasting outward and blowing even the surrounding stages to smithereens. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience with a single tap of her foot, Alienor surrounded the entire region in a familiar golden glow, saving the audience from another potential horror story. Lionel and Miguel didn't miss a beat. Even as they fell from the skies, their knees and elbows clashed, each boom resonating like the collapse of a mountain. With every collision, Lionel felt his internal organs shake and quake. The gap in their strength was undeniable, and the penetrative power of Miguel's force was deep and immeasurable. Not only was his strength beyond Lionel's, but his application of it was in another world. However, the smile on Lionel's face became a grin, and that grin quickly became a fiendish spread of pearly whites that seemed to radiate a light of its own. In that moment, bronze runes raced into existence around his skin, a crown marking his forehead and a halo hovering above his head. Bang! The next collision of their knees sounded like metal meeting metal, their elbows clashing soon after to sound like hammer meeting anvil. The two crashed onto the ground, Miguel's body suddenly erupting with a mysterious golden white force that twinkled as though tiny crystals were falling within it. The moment Lionel landed collided with him again, it was as though he had gained 10 layers of armor. Miguel was as unmovable as a mountain. His strikes were sharp and decisive, and though not as fast as one would expect from a Lux Nix, it carried an overbearing quality to it that made one feel as though a giant was stomping down on you from above. This sort of momentum alone was enough to make most fall into despair. It filled you with the kind of emotion that made you feel small and insignificant, like a speck of dust among the stars or a drop of water amidst the ocean. Visit. For the best no_vel_ed_ng experience, however, something about it only made Lionel fight back harder. As though he couldn't feel the pain of his limbs and fists crashing against an immovable wall, he collided with it again and again, his movements becoming faster and faster as he seemed to release everything he had. Miguel looked like a deity, his golden hair hanging in the air unaffected by its surroundings, his fists and kicks jetting out while his torso seemed unmoved and unhurried. Even his gaze didn't flicker as he met Lionel's onslaught, almost as though he was watching a toddler put together their final tantrum. Lament. The word came out of nowhere, and yet the strike that followed behind it was unlike any that came before. A mysterious energy layered Miguel's fist, his strength crashing toward Lionel like a fall meteor. Lionel's gaze flickered, his own fist jetting outward, wrapped by universal force he had been holding back on all this time. Bang! Lionel felt his arm threaten to collapse, his feet leaving 2 trenches in his wake as he shot backward. Overwhelmed. Miguel didn't move from his spot, he didn't feel like he had to. 1 meter, tens of meters, it didn't matter. When he spoke, the world listened. Visit. For a better_user experience, a second fist surged forward, the air snapping and cracking as sparks of fire formed beneath the sheer speed of the strike alone. Lionel's pupils constricted. This strike was at least 10 times the strength of the last, he had no chance to block this with his fists. Chapter 1234. Bang. A pillar of smoke rose in the air, the ground combusting as though an explosive had been hidden within. But just as quickly as Miguel's strike landed, the mighty roar of a bear resounded. The smoke and dust plumes were forcefully disrupted, a concentrated beam of light jetting outward like a laser, relentlessly piercing through the skies as though it might split anything in its path in two. In that moment, a 10-meter-tall bear rose up on its hind legs. Beneath the dispersed smoke, its aura towered and its strength pulsed in all directions, not much unlike its roar. Even the ground itself seemed to want to submit. The bear was both illusory and not, its body covered from head to toe in resplendent golden fur and its eyes shimmering like stars that held the depth of the universe. However, while its body itself seemed ethereal and unreal, on top of it was an armor of dense gray, so heavy that what remained of the stone beneath the bear cracked and shattered further. Without hesitation, the bear charged after the beam of light, following after it with a tremendous momentum. Lionel trailed its back, much of his figure hidden behind the enormous beast construct, but his gaze had become cold and focused, his fiendish grin giving way to a calculating light. Miguel of course recognized the bear construct, but he had never seen it appear with armor. In just a moment he could tell that Lionel had fused the Luxnix Force Art system with another. Even after realizing this though, he didn't spare any thought toward being impressed, nor did his expression fluctuate. His palm flipped over, a sword as light as a feather and as thin as a finger appearing in his hand. Visit. For a better_user experience, the moment it did, his whole demeanor seemed to change. His indifferent expression, unmoved by the world even if the moon fell from the skies, gained a bit of haughtiness between his brows. An arrogance that had been buried deep within his bones blossomed like a blooming flower, his first hint of an expression shining forth. The individuals of the Luxnix watched on with widened eyes. They hadn't seen Miguel use his sword against a member of his generation since he was 10 years old. No, that wasn't accurate. Those like Elodie and Siller were technically a part of Lionel's mother's generation. The truth was that Miguel had never used his sword against a member of his generation, and he hadn't used it against the generation plus one his senior since he was a child. Miguel's sword pierced forward. It seemed to carry no momentum with it, no forcefulness or power. In fact, it could only be said to be beautiful and elegant, the kind of strike that looked pretty in a practice book and could be expounded upon in a painting, but lacked the foundation of comprehension and strength it should have had. Or so it seemed. The beam of light separated into two beneath Miguel's sword as though it was nothing more than a dying flame's final twinkle. It split past his shoulders, continuing toward the barriers in the distance where it seemed to have lost all of its momentum. And yet, bang! The barriers shuddered and threatened to collapse. The power behind it was so great that the arena itself shook and quaked, the rustling of the pillars that held it up making a few cowards feel as though they should prepare to run. However, for everyone else, they couldn't seem to take their eyes off of what they were seeing for even a moment. The elegant stroke of Miguel's sword didn't lose momentum in the slightest. He only took a single step forward, and yet he seemed to appear dozens of meters away in the next instant. The latest _sodies are on the website. The final roar of the bear construct resounded, and it even sounded somewhat sad, its body collapsing into two pieces before vanishing into sparkling motes of light. Lionel, who had been following very closely behind, narrowed his gaze. He had indeed fused the Luxnix force arts with another. He had used fourth-dimensional star core, which he could produce with ease thanks to his metal body, and then strengthened it with Camelot's magic system to form a new defensive mage art. And yet it was split in just a single strike. Even with the coldness of his gaze now, a flicker of rouge couldn't help but manifest as his heartbeat grew steadier and deeper. In that moment, his fiendish grin almost returned. In a blink, Miguel and Lionel appeared before one another. Just when it seemed that Lionel would suffer the same fate as the beam of light and the bear construct before him, his aura bloomed, the temperature plummeting as a spear of black ice appeared in his hands. Lionel didn't hold back for even a moment, his level 2 spear force bursting forth and a blinding golden spear splitting the crown on his forehead in two. Orenic's expression changed wildly when he saw this. A seventh heir. The shock even overshadowed the fact Lionel had had level 2 spear force from the very beginning. Bang. Visit. For the best no _undershinji experience spear and sword met. A wild crackling of ice and a plummeting temperature appearing to one side, and on the other a blazing golden white light shimmering with falling gems. The two shot backward beneath their opponent's strength, but just as quickly as their feet landed, they sprung forward with an even faster pace. Spear and sword left afterimages in the air, the collision of blades, light, ice and force feeling like a fireworks ceremony of untouchable proportions. Miguel's level 2 sword force vibrated wildly. His speed touched another level as he swapped between techniques of the Luxnix as though he was doing nothing more than breathing. He didn't even seem to have trouble interrupting his technique midway to switch to another, countering Lionel's spear play at every corner. Lionel's gaze almost seemed to rage with a ring of gold and crimson, the spear domain lineage factor's mark on his forehead growing in brightness with each passing moment. Miguel retrieved his sword, the arrogance between his brows only growing. Divide. His voice was layered and almost seemed like a fusion of a god and devil, commanding the world to yield beneath its call. Visit. For the best no _undershinji experience, Lionel didn't take a single step back, the raging violet aura around him growing in size to the point a miniature humanoid figure appeared before his head. Dragon's might. Bang. Chapter 1235. Shirring. Shirring. Shine. Shine. The sound of sharpening blades rang out in all directions. In that moment, a strong inner will pulsed, fusing into the surroundings and making the air feel several times heavier than it had in the past. Lionel's spear pulled back and drew an arc upward through the air. It moved so quickly that a streak of blackish blue was all anyone could seem to see, the strength of his level 2 spear force multiplying several times over in the blink of an eye. Miguel didn't miss a beat, activating in almost the same instant Lionel had. Despite the fragile look of his blade, it clashed with Lionel's almost demonic spear without losing ground. Miguel found that the strength of his words had dampened the moment that small violet humanoid figure appeared. It was as though his will was clashing with Lionel's, canceling each other out. This was the first time Miguel had ever experienced someone nullifying his words, and for yet another first time, his gaze couldn't help but narrow. Suddenly, Miguel shifted, retrieving his sword and guarding it against his body as though to take on a fencing stance. His free hand pressed his fore and middle fingers together, the odd white gold precipitating crystal force around him concentrating toward the tips of those two digits. Instead of pursuing, Lionel's dream force surged, the halo above his head pulsing as though it had a mind of its own. A violent upswell of force surged out in all directions, splitting the battlefield into two sides surrounded by a tornado of rotating winds. On one side, 4 silver pillars rose up from the earth, depictions of battles and grandeur etched onto their surfaces. Beneath its presence, it felt as though space itself had been frozen, as though it could be paused, undone, flattened and lengthened at the behest of Lionel. There was no doubt that after fusing with his divine armor, Lionel's space affinity had taken another enormous leap forward. In fact, due to the evolution his mother had granted him, even 6-dimensional space bent to his whims. The latest _sodies are on the website. On the other side, the sparkling droplets of crystal that had surrounded seemed to quickly gather, sticking to one another and quickly growing in size beneath the strength of a mysterious command. It was a sight that was objectively gorgeous, but it only became more when Miguel's free hand trembled, a final twinkle of light breathing life into the gems that fell around him. In that moment, dozens of crystal wolves formed on the ground and dozens more crystal hawks took over the skies. It felt almost impossible to catch them with the naked eye unless the sun's rays hit them just right, but when they did, a beautiful sight one could hardly match was seen. All this time, the crowd had been on the edge of their seats, not having been prepared for the kind of battle they would witness today. But this scene made them all gasp in admiration in one moment, then feel their hearts seize in the next. Those that were sharper felt the danger force their small hairs to stand up. These beast constructs made Lionel's previous formulations feel like nothing more than child's play. Each and every single one of them had the strength of the sixth dimension. Lionel's gaze narrowed from within his. It seems that his speculations were correct. The root or the power source that gave the Luxnix Force art system its lifelike characteristics wasn't entirely related to the language itself, but also in the uniqueness of Snow Force. It was only when incorporating it that it could show its full strength, something that naturally happened since Snow Force had a positive impact on Soul Force and internal sight. The problem then became obvious. Miguel had stepped beyond Snow Force, but his Luxnix Force arts likewise gained an enormous boost along with it. Lionel had been so worried about what a lack of techniques would look like if he abandoned the Snowy Star Owl that he hadn't realized that it was all already right under his nose. The crystal beast constructs shot forward. Their speed was far beyond what Miguel could muster and they had already appeared before Lionel's barrier in the blink of an eye. Miguel stood straight tall, his sword wielding had pressed to his chance as he entered a perfect stance. In that moment his energy began to gather, his strength slowly accumulating. Even to this point, Miguel hadn't suffered a single injury. His body seemed to still be warming up to the battle, almost as though it didn't feel like it was necessary to snap itself fully away. Even the arrogance between Miguel's brows was only very slowly becoming more prominent. It felt like his true face was only now beginning to be shown to the world and everything else was nothing more than an elaborate facade. The howl of the wolves resounded as they pounced toward Lionel's barrier. Bang, 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 bang. Lionel's pupils constricted. For the first time, cracks appeared and began to race about his like spider webs. He had always known that there was a limit to just how much pressure his self-created mage art could take, but he was still astonished by this. This was just a few of Miguel's beast constructs. What if he had attacked personally instead? The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel didn't linger on these thoughts for long, his force surging as the cracks mended. In that moment, the barrier began to bulge, numerous bubbles appearing as he formed one after another, each attached with its own law. They shot outward. Before the beast constructs could react, they found themselves being enveloped by the violet-hued spears. Just like that, they lost their connection with Miguel, becoming nothing more than piles of useless gems. Lionel's palm closed into a fist, crushing them to ash. The skies. It felt as though everything had fallen into darkness. It was the kind of shift that made one feel as though a natural phenomenon was descending, the kind that commanded the attention of all. Lionel had just not been among them because the beast constructs was something he knew he had to deal with first, even knowing that Miguel was preparing something. But when he saw it, Lionel's gaze pervaded with a piercing coldness. Up above, the high sun had completely vanished, replaced by a blanket of darkness. The first of the universal cycles was the Four Seasons realm. This first stage embodied the call of the seasons, leaving its four pillars up the interpretation of the masses. The second universal cycle was the heavenly body realm. This second embodied the rotation of the celestial behemoths that called the skies home. It touched upon the artistic conception that gave them their beauty and unique character. The third universal cycle was the natural light realm. The birth of dawn, the brightness of day, the decline of dusk, and the darkness of night. It didn't take Lionel long to realize that Miguel had grasped a night comprehension for his sword. Everything felt so all-encompassing and grand, even to the point of blanketing the entire arena in black. Lionel hadn't even grasped the heavenly body realm yet, but he was facing someone who had grasped night with his sword. Lionel had never understood why the natural light realm existed beyond the Four Seasons and heavenly body realm. It felt like it should have been the very first he came to understand. There were only more of these inconsistencies lingering beyond, and this was the honest reason why he had never been able to step beyond it. After the natural light realm came the cosmos realm, which was divided into comprehension of the galaxy, sector, domain and universe. This seemed like it somewhat made sense, at least in this case. The cosmos was indeed beyond the seasons and the heavenly bodies. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. But right after that came the pinnacle of universal force. The constellation realm? In this realm, one would create 4 constellation pillars for yourself, each representing a different portion of your strength. That sounded all well and good, but how the hell was a constellation beyond the cosmos? For Lionel, who liked to have a logical progress to everything, and a solid understanding of everything he grasped, it threw his mind for a loop, resulting in him stagnating in the 4 seasons realm for so long. If he had a choice in the matter, it would be natural light realm, then 4 seasons realm, then heavenly body realm, followed by the constellation realm, and finally the cosmos realm. That all made so much more sense. So what the hell was this? Lionel shook his head. He seemed to have completely forgotten that he was in battle and currently facing an attack powered by the artistic conception of the 6th dimension. However, Miguel didn't seem to have forgotten at all. Who knew how everyone would react if they knew what was going on in Lionel's mind right this moment? The dichotomy of light and darkness seemed to play for Miguel exceptionally well, his own brightness only being accentuated. Lionel's gaze somewhat regained their focus, his mind still feeling dissatisfied. Maybe he should grill the old bastard about it. From darkness comes light. Shroud the world and multiply my might. Miguel raised his sword high in the skies, it trembling slightly beneath the accumulating force. A blinding light divided the night as Miguel's sword fell. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. And, sorry everyone, just one chapter today, sad face. Chapter 1236. Lionel could feel the artistic conception behind Miguel's strike just as clearly as he could see the scythe of force blazing toward him. It was as though something about Miguel's comprehension had a breath of life of its own, whispering into the ears of all who saw it. Of course, this wasn't out of the kindness of its heart. Rather, it was due to an inborn arrogance, the kind that refused to allow itself to be unknown and ignored. The roar of force was deafening, and as everything else fell to darkness, it was the one and only source of light. Lionel's lip couldn't help but curl. Faced with such an unbridled haughtiness, the hidden foundation of his own persona that silently fueled his every action and thought seemed to have been stirred. For Miguel to make it seem like he was the only source of light in this world before him? How arrogant could you get? Kinetic domain. Lionel's hair whipped about wildly, its short strands moving about like they had minds of their own. The dense violet aura around him only grew denser, the subtle purple color of his barriers thickening to the point it was almost impossible to see anything other than the outline of Lionel's figure through them. The force in the surroundings seemed to have been quelled beneath Lionel's forcefulness, but the gap was simply too large. Kinetic domain was built on the foundation of a quasi-silver spear, making it a half-step from the 6th dimension. However, the universal force Miguel was using was fueled by a 6th-dimensional comprehension. The difference was enormous. But, visit. For a better user experience, Lionel was also ready for this. Miguel's weakened by as much as 20%, this energy being snatched away by Lionel. With a single stomp forward, Lionel's figure forced the arena to quake. The 4 pillars that surrounded him only glowed with a fiercer light, so brightly in fact, that they seemed to blend into one, making it go almost completely unnoticed when 2 of them vanished from thin air. Lionel took another heavy stomp forward, his legs crossing the violet barrier before him, but his figure so shrouded by light that it was only possible to notice with exceptional internal sight. But even then, the trouble was that any attempt to do so felt like throwing a rock into an ocean. With Lionel's greater comprehension of internal sight thanks to his study of the Luxnick's manipulation techniques, he had a deeper appreciation for exactly what it was. Ultimately, internal sight was just an outward projection of soul force, and even more fundamentally, was just a blanket of energy. In that case, why wouldn't his kinetic domain swallow it up as well? All anyone could see to focus on was the collision of 2 blinding lights. So, when they suddenly found Lionel appearing just a single meter away from Miguel's figure, his spear raised high in the air and his force having reached its peak, their eyes couldn't help but widen. Miguel had only just unleashed a powerful strike. It seemed to have taken a few seconds for him to cast. It was impossible to prepare a defense so quickly. Also, they couldn't wrap their heads around just how Lionel had done it. Teleporting past such an attack wasn't child's play. If that was possible, Space Force would be ranked even higher than it was, and those that wielded it would be invincible. Visit. For a better user experience, the more force density an environment has, the more difficult it is to use Space Force. Even the likes of the Radix family, far inferior to Miguel and the Luxnix, were able to take advantage of this principle to make Lionel's teleportation abilities useless. The higher the quality of the Force, the more difficult it became. In addition, the more volatile and unpredictable the Force, the greater the unpredictability of teleportation as well. This was all to say that when Miguel prepared an attack with 6-dimensional strength like he just had, teleporting even in the general vicinity should have been almost impossible, especially for a 5th-dimensional existence like Lionel. But the fact Lionel had not only done so, but he had even teleported directly through the line of attack, appearing right in front of Miguel. It was a feat extraordinary to a degree that was almost impossible to describe. However, what happened next was somehow even more baffling. Miguel's gaze narrowed, his free hand already gathering his odd white gold gem-like force again. But he had only just began when his pupils constricted, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Under the astonished eyes of the public, 2 blinding pillars rose to Miguel's back, their violet barrier twinkling for just a moment. In that instant, Miguel's attack collided with Lionel's other barrier, the sound of space whining and groaning feeling like a fork scraping against the bottom of a pot. Bang! The barrier shattered. But Miguel's blade force had also vanished into thin air. For all but a single moment. A second bang resounded. This one, however, was right behind Miguel. To his front, Lionel's spear descended, the coldness in the latter's eyes carrying with it an intent that wouldn't be denied, the kind of intent that seemed to match and then overshadow Miguel's own as though it had had its dignity challenged. To his back, an attack of his own design assaulted him. It had dimmed considerably from the first time he had levied it, but that didn't seem to matter given the situation. He had just deployed his force, he couldn't do so again so quickly and easily, and any attack he did form would be far too flimsy. Lionel's spear fell, fueled by a portion of Miguel's own strength. His calculation was perfect and without flaw, even down to the landing location of Miguel's own strike. You would end this right here. Visit for a better user experience. Bang. Bang. The cacophonic booms of the landed attack resonated throughout the arena, its entire foundation sinking down by what felt like an entire meter. Chapter 1237. The experts in the crowd found their hearts skipping a beat. Redirecting attacks using Space Force, teleporting them through space and changing their trajectory was so by far and away more difficult than simply teleporting through volatile force that it could only be labeled as impossible. Being able to perfectly reflect attacks, even, was so difficult that it took one being a savant like Candle to be able to do it. Lionel had redirected attacks before against the oceanic beasts of Earth. But they had been so much weaker than him to begin with that the two feats couldn't even be compared. If a 6th-dimensional expert wanted to reflect the attack of a 5th-dimensional one, it was a matter of a wave of a palm. They were essentially a god to a mortal to begin with. However, doing so with an attack at, or even worse, above your level like Lionel had was so unfathomable that if it wasn't for the resonating booms, the entire arena would have fallen into complete silence. The expressions of those of the Luxnix were incredibly ugly. The truth was that after seeing Aliénor's strength, they realized just how ignorant they had been. They had all been aware that she was still within the 6th dimension, so they never thought too much of her strength. This wasn't too surprising. Earth had only completed its metamorphosis about 5 years ago, so when Aliénor blossomed to her true strength, the Luxnix had already concluded what they believed her limits were and had no idea just how vastly she had improved. They had no idea how large the gap between two individuals of the same dimension could be. It only made matters worse that Y Star Order, their most respected ancestor, had chosen Lionel's side to begin with and now even seemed to have been enslaved by Rija's branch of the family. Visit for the best no_vel_ed_ng experience. The Starry Order elders of the family already understood that they had lost this battle, but it was hard to just shift their mentalities after decades of placing their hope in just one young man. Many of them still hoped that Miguel would win, even if it wasn't logical. They were human after all. Seeing such a scene before them, it was difficult to accept. But maybe luckily for them, they weren't the only ones with a frown on their faces at this moment, because oddly enough, Lionel himself was among them. Lionel held onto his spear firmly, it bowing beneath his strength. Compared to its usual black ice form, it was currently smoldering and filled with an unbridled heat that scorched even the air. But it was also precisely because of this that the fog and plumes of smoke took so long to clear. And when it did, Lionel's gaze couldn't help but narrow further. Just about 10 meters away from Lionel, Miguel seemed to be in a sorry state. His untouched robes had been torn to shreds, leaving barely enough to cover his decency. However, that was all. Miguel's skin shimmered like it was carved of crystal. There was a hint of blood at the corner of his lips and several cracks across his body, but he still rose slowly from the ground, a light cough leaving him. The haughtiness between his brows seemed to have undergone an evolution. It was so pronounced and clear that it almost felt like one was looking at a completely different person. From indifferent, standoffish and cold, Miguel was only a blinding chain of precious metals away from looking every bit the part of a lifelong gangster. Miguel ripped the top of his robes away from himself, spitting out the mouthful of blood that was accumulating on his tongue. The cracks that ran along his toned body slowly fused and vanished one by one, the thumping of his heart suddenly treating his body like an instrument to project outward. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. The beating resonated with the crystal that coated him, vibrating his body to a special frequency that pulled at the heart. Lionel could see at a glance that Miguel wasn't just arrogant, he was also a bit of a madman who happened to also be extraordinarily hard-working. Not everyone could just swallow metals and end up with a physique like Lionel's, especially for Miguel, who was born with the snowy star owl lineage factor that wasn't known for its robust body to begin with. Every line of muscle, every inch of definition, every outline striation and pulsing vein, was the result of his own meticulous work. And it seemed that Lionel had finally knocked him awake. Miguel rose his palms to his hair, running his fingers through it and slicking it back. His actions were slow and didn't seem very special, but the oppressive aura he was giving off only seemed to grow as the thumping of his heart grew louder and louder. By a certain point, it no longer sounded like the steady beat of an organ but had rather become a thrumming war drum, the gems that coated his body becoming thicker and thicker. Miguel threw a glance toward his thin sword. It had fallen a pace before him and was so deeply entrenched into the ground that only the hilt was visible. With a wave of his palm, the sword flew to Miguel's hand. One would have thought that he had done so for the purpose of battle, but what he actually used it for was nothing short of jarring. Miguel gazed at the sword for a moment, raising it up to eye level as though he was trying to inspect every detail. Visit. For the best no_Shinji experience, and then his mouth suddenly opened wide. His canines lengthened and a growl left his lip. Clang. Click. Zish. He bit down hard, the blade suddenly shattering into countless pieces he swallowed with a single inhale. The gems that coated Miguel's body began to glow a healthy light, complex royal blue runes beginning to swirl about within them, making him look more like an otherworldly treasure than a human. Bang. Bang. Within Miguel's palms, two enormous greatswords appeared. Each was over 2 meters long and 2 feet wide. Their weight falling to the ground alone left 2 enormous craters Miguel didn't seem to care he had begun to sink into. A fiendish, devilish grin spread across his lips, his body seeming to grow a size. I was already sick and tired of using that twig. Since you've woken me up, come and taste true strength. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Miguel's foot rose into the air, the momentum of the world following his step. Chapter 1238. Miguel was so fast that Lionel could only react on instinct, quickly crossing his spear over his chest. It was like those enormous great swords were no heavier than a single feather, or so it seemed with the ease Miguel swung them. The spear across Lionel's chest immediately found itself bending in protest. Despite the fact Lionel had wanted to use it to protect himself, a strong, surging force bent it to the point it barreled into his sternum, causing his body to bow backward and fly out with a bang. A projectile of blood flew from Lionel's mouth, his entire rib cage threatening to shatter. If it wasn't for his bronze runes dispersing the force throughout his body, maybe his lungs and heart would have been riddled with bone shards by now. Lionel could tell that Miguel had instead lost his speed and most importantly, his agility. However, when it came to a straight line bound and leap forward, strength alone could often overwhelm speed. And now that Miguel had taken the initiative, he proved this about as well as you possibly could. Miguel howled, his hair fluttering about wildly. He looked like a beast that had been released from its chains, his attack and pursuit relentless as though he couldn't feel fatigue. Every time he landed the ground would collapse, every time he shot forward an abyss would be left in his wake, every time he attacked the air split and sparking flames followed his swing as the atmosphere cried for mercy. Lionel found his body being beaten and bruised. He managed to find a way to block every time, but he could never escape the pain that came with it. His wrists threatened to shatter, his shoulders were continuously almost ripped from their sockets, and his legs and torso were beginning to show signs of deep internal bleeding, splotches of a grotesque blackish violet spreading beneath their skin. The latest _IP_SODIES are on the website. Blazing dawn. Dauntless day. The gold of Miguel's hair and eyes became like a blazing sun. Even his eyebrows followed suit, the endless flood of it making him look like a deity descended from the skies above. And yet, his coarse laughter and his fiendish grin warped that persona, giving him the image of endless bloodlust, the kind that could only be matched by a god of war. Howl. Miguel's howls caused the golden barriers that protected the audience to tremble and vibrate. The crowd could only imagine just how loud it was for Lionel, who was trapped in there. Whether by coincidence or design, everyone seemed to have landed on the same conclusion. This arena had become a cage and Lionel happened to be stuck in there with a beast. The Luxniks had quite frankly never seen this side of Miguel. Not only had he abandoned the light flexible sword that was the symbol of their family, but he didn't even seem to be using snow force any longer. They couldn't help but feel that the Miguel that they had all come to know was a facade from the very beginning, nothing more than an image he projected out to them. This was the true Miguel. An unrelenting, furious, battle maniac who wielded his swords like clubs and bellowed out war cries as though he wouldn't be satisfied until the whole of the dimensional verse heard his name. Bang. Visit. For a better user experience Lionel against the golden barrier, another cough of blood leaving his lips. By now his clothes were in tatters. Where his skin was exposed no longer shone as resplendently as they had before, even his bronze runes seemed to have dimmed considerably. Miguel's relentless pursuit didn't pause for even a moment. Blazing like a golden meteor, he shot into the air, falling down toward Lionel with both his great swords raised high above his head. His hair and eyebrows gave of wisps of white gold fog. His eyes had begun to glow so bright that the whites had vanished, replaced by orbs of gold that pulsed with light. Lionel watched this scene, a light breath leaving his lips. Even that alone made him feel like his entire body was on fire. Alright, if a brawl is what you want, come and have a brawl. Lionel's eyes closed for a moment, making it truly seem as though he had given in. But when they opened, his eyes too had become nothing more than orbs of light. However, his own blazed like shimmering sapphires, his aura imploding in the form of a pillar that seemed to want to pierce the skies. Star fusion. The latest _IP_SODIES are on the website. Wild plumes of sky blue smoke shot out from Lionel, his body suddenly vanishing from its position and appearing above Miguel. His white shirt was ripped from himself, revealing a torso no less ripped and defined than Miguel's own. His bronze runes were flooded with vital star force, causing them to pulse with the very same blue light as his halo hung above his head. Miguel continued to fall, unable to change his direction. But Lionel had already closed in, his feet slamming down on the top of the former's back and driving him into the ground. Bang. Miguel twisted in the air, blocking Lionel's foot with the flat of his blade and swinging forward with his other, his gaze lit with thoughts of splitting him in two. But what he found instead was Lionel's own blade. Spear and sword met in the skies, the reverberating impact sending Lionel spiraling so far into the air that he crashed into the barrier once again. At the same time, Miguel careened into the ground, falling into such a deep pit that it wasn't immediately obvious what happened to him. Unfortunately though, this wasn't the kind of battle that had lulls and pauses. Two almost mindless roars shook the stadium. Visit. For a better user experience in the ground below, Miguel's aura alone shattered everything in its path, forcing the rocks to crumble and the surrounding walls to fall into the abyss. The elevation where the stages and platforms had been at fell by more than 50 meters, leaving a sinkhole that spread out for hundreds more. In the skies, Lionel's bellow shattered the ceiling of the golden dome, shards of white gold glass falling in all directions and precipitating in a beautiful rainfall. And then, a streak of blinding blue and another of blinding gold tore a path toward one another, meeting in the skies and causing a boom that deafened the ears of all those that heard it. Chapter 1239. Spear and great swords met in an endless torrent of attacks. Every collision caused shards of whistling wind to fly out in all directions. It was the kind of display of power that made one cringe and turn your head away, worried that their bodies wouldn't be able to handle what came next and find itself bent awkwardly and out of shape. However, the wild grins on both of their faces seemed to paint a different picture entirely. They were completely relentless. Even when they were pushed to the ground, they sprung back up like springs, already prepared for the next 10 exchanges. Bang! The two were forcefully separated, finding themselves on opposite sides of the arena. Their breathing was even and deep, the thumping of their hearts and the rushing of their blood booming like drums and falling like waterfalls. Miguel exhaled a deep breath, a fog rising up from his swords as though they were being seared with heat. Dying embers of dusk. The 4 cycles came together. Without even stepping into the 6th dimension, Miguel had actually comprehended the entirety of the natural light realm. The glow in Lionel's gaze intensified. The strength of 1, 2 or 3 facets of a universal cycle was absolutely nothing compared to when they were deployed all at once. Only upon doing so would the true strength of universal force shine through. The only light of night. Blazing dawn. Dauntless day. Dying embers of dusk. The cycle of day, night, dawn and dusk rotated about the skies, the center of the world being Miguel himself. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel exhaled his own breath. He hadn't even bothered to bring out his 4 seasons comprehension. Because it was true state, it could probably match 1 stage above, but 2 was too large of a gap to bridge. If he brought it out now, he would only end up countered and put himself on the back foot. But Lionel had more cards than he had shown. In the dimensional cleanse trial zone, Lionel had formed 3 forms of, not just 1. The issue was that the amount of vital star force he had was so small to begin with that executing just the first form only lasted a few minutes. Unfortunately, most of the accumulated vital star force Lionel had left the trial world with had been taken away by the segmented cube. Of course, it was vital to saving his life and making sure no lingering injuries crippled his hands, so it was a worthy exchange. Due to this, though, it took Lionel weeks to even months to accumulate enough vital force just for a few minutes of usage. At least, that was the case in a weak galaxy like the Milky Way. But Lionel wasn't there any longer, now was he? Lionel had already been on planet Luxnix for more than a month. Not only was it a pinnacle 6th-dimensional world, it was perfectly chosen by the Luxnix for its high light and star elemental concentration. In that case, wasn't it perfect? The first stage of star fusion was. The second stage, though. Lionel's lips spread into a wild grin, the red in his eyes pulsing as the blue about him became a blazing curtain of crimson. Visit. For the best he experienced, a chorus of red raced across Lionel's body as he howled into the skies. His own cry sounded for more maddened than anything Miguel had been able to form. His body seemed to spring to life, a pair of wings that stretched outward for 10 meters each appearing to his back and his body being covered in delicate white gold scales, each etched with golden runes and shaped like small miniature feathers. The billowing fog emitting from Lionel's head seemed to make his hair turn scarlet and lengthen, snaking out in all directions like wild hydras surging out from murky waters. With a single flap of Lionel's wings, the air around him shattered like glass, the ground splintering like an eggshell and the howling call of his roar being left behind by the sonic boom of his own speed. He appeared before Miguel in the blink of an eye, but the latter had already swung down one of his great swords, the power behind it carrying with it the strength of the natural light realm. Bang! The two erupted into a flurry of exchanges. Lionel's body seemed to be nearly invulnerable, even in the rare instances where he suffered an injury, it closed so fast that it felt as though it had never been there to begin with. Miguel's skin shimmered like crystals, his impenetrable gem force and relentless attacks backing his domineering nature. He fought nothing like a Luxnix. There wasn't the slightest bit about him that was elegant or refined, not the slightest hint of what it meant to embody purity was on his mind. All he cared about was being the best, his arrogance prepared to make even the darkness of night and the light of day revolve around him. The two clashed and separated, their collisions rebounding all across the arena in a way that was almost impossible to follow. The crowd found their heads swiveling from side to side almost uncontrollably just so that they could try their best to keep up. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel retracted his spear before releasing an endless torrent of pierces. His speed was so blinding that it felt as though dozens of spears had appeared in his hand. Miguel swiped one of his great swords to the side, brutishly slapping Lionel's spear to the side, and swinging down from above. Lionel took a fast and strong step forward, punching out toward Miguel's chest. The sound of metal and crystal meeting resounded through the arena. Miguel flexed his back and widened his stance, absorbing the blow completely as he continued to swing down from above. Lionel's gaze flickered as he rotated to the side, barely stepping out of the downward swing and stamping down toward Miguel's wrist. However, as though he hadn't noticed, Miguel's forearm simply flexed, the blue runes swirling about his crystal skin jumping to life. In that moment, Lionel suddenly felt as though his foot had slammed into a steel wall. To make matters worse, Miguel suddenly released his grip on his sword, his palm snaking upward at an odd angle and catching Lionel's ankle. Lionel found himself being raised into the air, his gaze frighteningly cold. Bang! His body was pummeled into the ground only to be raised again. Visit. For the best no_undershirt_undershinji experience, force surged about Lionel's ankle, forcing Miguel to let go. Hooking the crook of his knee to Miguel's arm, he used the momentum to swing himself to the latter's back, choking around Miguel's neck with one arm and raising his spear to behead him with the other. Miguel roared, his neck bulging and his back erupting as a strong surge of force that sent Lionel flying backward. With another howl, Miguel beat his chest, sinking further and further into an undying madness. And then his skin began to change once more. Slowly but surely, the crystal morphed into something more tangible and heavy, fusing with the new coming substance and making it far stronger than it had been just alone. Chapter 1240? The crystal that coated Miguel's skin seemed to rapidly shrink, concentrating the pulsing blue runes that had run within them toward his forehead. His muscles bulged a fold in size, suddenly gaining a rough texture to them and eventually losing all of its color. Before the eyes of everyone, it became a thick, leathery coat, one that bulged with both power and a pure, unblemished white that gave off its own light. At the same time, Miguel's hair and eyes lost their gold color as well, becoming bright shades of white. It almost became impossible to see his hair as anything other than strings of lights. It didn't even look real any longer, having completely lost its physical form. The illusory form of a majestic elephant appeared to his back, a surging tide of gem force flooding the surroundings. Miguel didn't even seem to try, but everything was suddenly coated in his aura. The ground and even the golden walls that surrounded them all began to grow crystal formations of their own, almost like rapidly spreading ice-forming crystalline constructs. With a snap, Miguel's great sword flew back into his hand. A single flex of his forearm caused the sturdy metal to whine, the imprint of his palm and fingers being etched onto its body. The level of strength it took to accomplish such a feat was simply beyond one's wildest imagination, and yet he had done so on nothing more than a whim. Miguel's head tilted to the skies, a roar escaping his lips. Explosive, concentric circles of collapsing and booming wind shot out along with his voice, shattering everything in its wake. In that moment, a surge of force began to violently shoot toward Miguel, his chest and stomach expanding by a size as the gem on his forehead only grew all the brighter. Visit. For the best no_undershinji experience, Lionel flipped through the air, landing on his own 2 feet. His body was still covered by a blazing fog of red, a line of smoke rising from his body and becoming a thin line of energy in the air. From the moment Miguel ate his sword, Lionel had already understood what his ability was. Lionel had run into this ability before, but this was either a mutated form of it or it was a unique ability that mimicked what the original ability could do. Of course, this ability was the Swallower Ability Index, the very same ability shared by Hephaestus of Valiant Heart Mountain. Hephaestus was able to gain the abilities of the beast he ate, but this was a byproduct of the Steel Tier or Tier 4 of the Swallower Ability Index. Of course, Hephaestus could only do this for low-level beasts, so there was a heavy cap on when his ability was Tier 4 and when it was not, but Miguel seemed to be very different. Lionel was absolutely certain that Hephaestus could not eat a sword. The unspoken limitation of the Swallower Ability Index was that whatever was eaten had to be organic. But clearly not only was Miguel not bound by this, but he even seemed to be capable of swallowing the force in the atmosphere, forcefully refueling himself and making it all his own. When faced with such a person, not only was their stamina practically endless, but their affinities suddenly became whatever they wanted it to be. If Hephaestus ate a low-level creature and it happened to have a sturdy bone structure, he would gain a portion of that. If it had a fire elemental affinity, he would also gain a portion of that. So on and so forth. But what about Miguel? If he swallowed force itself, what did that represent? What did it mean? What if he swallowed a force crystal? A pure force crystal? The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. With his ability, could he give himself whatever affinity he wanted so long as he ate enough? In fact, couldn't Miguel hunt and kill humans as well, swallowing their ethereal glabellas to take from them what he pleased? This level of innate talent was something even he had to respect. Lionel slowly walked toward Miguel. He could somewhat understand how the Starry Order elders felt. Miguel might, quite frankly, be one of the only people in existence capable of adapting to an innate node that wasn't his own. In fact, he was capable of adapting to almost anything so long as he had time and the resources before him. Lionel's spear swept out to his side, the casual action causing many of Miguel's forming crystalline structures to shatter beneath the wind pressure alone. The sound of shattering glass and falling crystals resounded, the beauty of the resonance feeling nothing like the sight of the destruction. Miguel's inhale ended, the devilish grin on his face having grown only wider as his gaze landed on Lionel. He seemed to have grown an extra foot tall. His body up to his neck was covered by thick, leathery skin and his eyes were nothing but glowing orbs of white, following the tone set by his hair. The twinkling gem force around him only grew further in density, the small shards suddenly growing to the size of fists hailing down from the skies above. The rough beating of them and Miguel's heart seemingly fusing into one deathly rhythm. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_ng experience judgment. Miguel's voice seemed to have dropped by an entire octave. Even before the attack came, Lionel's pupils constricted, his body flipping backward and just barely dodging an enormous crystal pillar that had appeared from thin air. However, his feet had barely touched the ground again when his wings were forced to flap with all their strength, sending him beaming out of the way of another falling crystal pillar. Miguel's uproarious laughter resounded as these thick, destructive pillars continued to manifest from thin air. Judgment. 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 Bang. 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 A relentless barrage fell. The momentum was so great that the wind pressure alone made Lionel feel as though his skin was being torn in two. The golden barrier could finally no longer withstand the pressure. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. 3 crystal pillars fell all at once, cutting off Lionel's path of retreat from all sides. When they hit the ground in unison, everything shattered, shards of gold flying wildly throughout the arena. Chapter 1241. Lionel's expression flickered. Having these wings seemed cool, but it made the over-kilometer-long diameter of the arena seem far too small. To make matters worse, because Lionel had become used to them being nothing more than an illusion, having them become a sudden tangible part of him left him feeling awkward and uncoordinated. He realized then that he definitely should have spent the last few days going over the Luxnix family techniques that helped use these enormous pair of wings instead of getting lost in his game of chess with Y-Star Order. But, as they say, hindsight was 20/20. The coldness in Lionel's gaze returned. He had lost himself in having fun in this battle and he hadn't been his usual self. The battles he had fought in the dimensional verse until now all felt like a struggle of life and death, so he never wasted time playing around. He would drown his opponent out in calculations and cut the simplest path to victory every time. Often he didn't even have emotions or straying thoughts of his own, he was like an efficient machine, executing its orders. At this point, feeling that he was very quickly running out of power-ups to use, and simultaneously feeling that Miguel still had depths he had yet to expose, Lionel was tempted to revert to his usual battle style. It was quite ironic just how perfect a reflection of Lionel that Miguel was. Though the latter didn't have the former's calculative abilities, most of Miguel's battles usually ended just as easily. With what Miguel had comprehended from Lionel's innate node, he had even been able to one-shot the patriarch of the Viola family. Miguel hadn't used any of these comprehensions against Lionel, much like Lionel hadn't used his ability index much at all either. Of course, whether or not such comprehensions would be effective against Lionel was another matter entirely, but it was still the principle of the matter that truly counted. Miguel felt he didn't need to use Lionel's talent to defeat him. He could do it on his own. From the very beginning he was better. The 3 pillars savagely fell, Lionel's head tilting up and a smile spreading across his face. It wasn't laced with madness nor was there a fiendish aura to it. All it carried was a childish excitement. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel remembered well the first time he had experienced such a feeling. He was within Camelot's zone facing an army of demons. For the first time, the weight of killing others wasn't at the forefront of his mind. After all, what he faced weren't humans, they were cold-hearted monsters ready and willing to tear him limb from limb. That was the moment that apprehension, anxiety and guilt gave way, becoming the emotions that he had always felt, that he had always wanted to feel. A giddy excitement. It was clear that he had already made his decision. Not just a knight. I can be considered a mage too. It seems I won't be able to find out the limits of combustion today. Bang, bang, bang. Everything collapsed. The arena began to sink, the golden barriers shattered to pieces, harsh screams and cries of terror called out as many feared for their lives, feeling as though in the next moment, they would no longer be among the living. Eleanor reacted just as quickly. She had originally used the same defensive mechanism Orinik had because she didn't think that things would need to go so far. But it seems she had underestimated these two boys a bit. Visit. For the best no undershinji experience, it wasn't that their raw strength was so great, but their wills seemed to take tangible form, strengthening their attacks. They had already gained characteristics of the sixth-dimensional god path before even stepping foot into it. Lionel with his king's might, and Miguel with the odd power behind his words. Eleanor lightly tapped her foot, an enormous barrier forming. However, while her son's was a delicate violet color, her own was a vibrant green. In a moment everything settled just for an instant, that is. Bang. The three crystal pillars shattered to ash. Just as the gem shards shot out in all directions, an enormous pillar of violet force shot into the skies, outlining Lionel's figure as several force arts began to be quickly drawn in the air. The pupils of those who understood constricted. Most force arts were completely invisible to the naked eye as they were drawn by the ever-so-elusive soul force. For Lionel's own to take form and for them to even witness their drawing like this. Zigio, 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 Zigio. Arrows of earth, fire and light fell from the skies. But just as quickly as they formed, they evolved into spears and javelins, falling from the skies like a torrential rainfall. Visit. For a better user experience, Miguel's crystal constructs responded in kind, the skies becoming like the clash of fireworks, explosions of force, rock and stone erupting and fluttering motes of light falling from their collisions. On the ground, the two tore a path toward one another, one bathed in white and the other in violet. Boom. Lionel seemed completely invisible when strengthened by his king's might, and yet Miguel seemed just as much so. Every time Lionel dug deeper, he seemed to find a new ceiling, his strength climbing and growing. It was as though even when he said Lionel had awakened him, he was still in a deep sleep, slowly opening his eyes wider and wider with every collision. Miguel opened his mouth wide, biting at Lionel's spear, only to receive a swing of its butt to the side of the face. His head spun to the side, but he easily used that momentum to his advantage, allowing his torso and feet to spin into two great slashes with his great swords. Lionel also followed the momentum of his spear's blunt attack, carrying it over to place it in position to block both swings. His feet sunk down into the ground, his body quaking beneath the impact, only for him to realize too late that Miguel had sent 3 attacks, not just 2. A kick formed the third prong of the attack, colliding with Lionel's lower torso. Visit. For a better user experience, Miguel's wild, almost bestial offensive style forced Lionel to eat a loss soon after he had. Chapter 1242. Lionel skidded backward against the force of the kick, but the blow was forcefully dispersed to the ground beneath him. His control over the earth element had skyrocketed to an even higher level after entering. It felt as though the entire planet itself was backing his fight. His spear snaked forward, aiming for Miguel's head, throat and heart in quick succession. Every time he pierced it was as though a raging flood dragon followed his movements, his spearmanship becoming so pure and unabashed that it breathed like it had life of its own. Miguel's swordsmanship was several times more wild and lacked structure or foundation. Compared to the technique-driven style he had had while using his thin sword, and his ability to shift through one technique after another, always countering Lionel perfectly, he might as well have been a caveman now. But there was a special sort of air that was carried along by those simple strikes. They cut off all paths of retreat and thwarted deadly strikes with the greatest of ease, the explosive power that backed them feeling like they carried the weight of an entire world. Before anyone could realize just what had happened, over a day had already passed, each still being just as relentless as the other and it feeling as though they had an endless amount of trump cards and rebuttals to thrust at their opponent. However, it was slowly becoming clear that one had more to give than the other did. Lionel could apply this self-created knight technique he had formulated to amplify his mage arts. In addition, the drain on the vital star force supply he had was much lesser, as well as half the burden was taken on by his mind. Unfortunately, having great stamina versus having the ability to endlessly replenish your own were two different matters. Lionel, of course, had the gold-scaled koi fish, but he hadn't used its ability even once. Though he could probably say that it was his beast companion and get away with it, he didn't even think of doing so. He wanted to see to the depths of Miguel's limits, to force him to give everything he had and still realize that there was a taller mountain beyond. But it was becoming increasingly difficult to do so. The gap was large. Some would even say too large. Lionel had more than held his own, especially considering he was still holding back even at this moment. But Tier 4 was Tier 4 while Miguel was a half-step to the 6th dimension. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel's smile didn't fade, he found himself to be amusing. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to win his way. Lionel's spear blade swept along the ground, a massive wave of molten earth following it to attack Miguel. A crystal whale construct formulated into the skies. It was over 50 meters long, carrying with it a weight that couldn't even be fathomed. Boom. It dropped like an anchor before Lionel's attack, causing an explosion that took both at once. If it wasn't for the barrier formed by Alienor, there was no doubt that the destruction would have only been all the more violent. Lionel let out a heavy breath, sparks of fire leaving his lips. Deep breaths expanded and contracted his chest. A few fractures that could be found littered throughout his body, healing far more slowly than they had at the beginning of his battle, despite the fact the second awakening of his healing branch was very much active. In his moment of reprieve, Miguel had already closed the distance. Damn. Lionel's mind reacted quicker than his body, an enormous shield of earth blocking the swing of Miguel's blades. The twin great swords burst through, finding Lionel's spear laying in wait. But his defenses seemed weaker than usual. Visit. For the best experience, Lionel found himself flying through the air, shaking his head inwardly. He seemed to have been in a battle of equals with Miguel. But whenever each brought out a new trump card, wasn't it always him who was sent flying? This was exactly why he was so hesitant about bringing out all he had. If things were like this at this stage, shouldn't he find an opportunity to win before Miguel went all out? Lionel laughed at himself. What a silly thought. He hadn't been using his mind much during this battle, and he had actually let such a ridiculous conclusion to fester and grow to this point. Why was it that he had allowed Candle and Vice to roam free? Wasn't that because he would have to defeat all the savants of the dimensional verse one way or another? Why was it that he had kept his mind in reserve during this battle? Wasn't it so that he could bask in the feeling of an enjoyable battle? So why was he suddenly doing something so contradictory to both? A subtle feeling just within Lionel's grasp lingered before him. Sparks went off in his dreamscape, a network he had begun to build to rectify instinctual battling and logical battling feeling just a step away. It was like having a word ready at the tip of your tongue, but easy 10 times more infuriating. This feeling, Lionel closed his eyes, his breathing becoming steadier and steadier. The latest _IP_SODIes are on the website. Wasn't he the one who had said it didn't matter? If he wanted to claim that position at the top of the mountain for himself, why should he be constantly worried about the progress and strength of others? As long as he himself was strong enough. What did the rest of it matter for? What did the rest of it count for? Nothing. Nothing at all. The halo above Lionel's head began to glow a devastating brightness in that moment. As he flew through the air, it expanded to almost a meter in diameter, shooting down to Lionel's feet before slowly moving upward. Bang! Lionel landed and a cloud of dust shot in all directions. But in the next moment, a sight that none who had come this day would ever forget appeared. Lionel's figure vanished from sight beneath the commotion, but space itself seemed to freeze over. Everything was suddenly encased in a cube of ice, space itself solidifying into a tangible plane. And then, crack. Everything splintered. As though space had become a sheet of glass, it shattered, and yet it all seemed to be held together by an invisible force. The plumes of dust slowly began to clear, revealing a tall silhouette. The temperature plummeted by several degrees, a cold shiver creeping up the spines of many. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 1243. A harsh cold spread out in all directions, the air cracking at its seams as though dome of glass had just been shattered and was now barely holding itself together. Bright blues, deep purples and swirling blacks surged out in all directions, suddenly dispersing to reveal an armor the likes of which those here had simply never before laid their eyes upon. The divine armor was fitted with many plates, forming a complex and interlocking array of metals that made movement as smooth as fabric. It exuded a frosty aura, appearing as though a layer of beautiful blue, silver and black or was coated with a thin and reflective layer of ice. It spread out upon Lionel's wings without missing a single beat, flaps of metal sheets opening and closing as though it was breathing, releasing frosty steam that froze over space all the more. The helmet that covered Lionel's head completely hid his gaze, but the shimmering golden spear upon his forehead and the bronze halo above his head told a story of their own. Ornic's gaze narrowed. The divine armor technique was most definitely among the strongest of the Morales. But not everyone could forge their own, let alone to do so at this level. In fact, of all his abilities, Lionel's crafting was maybe the most untouchable. Miguel found himself stuck within frozen space. As fragile and on the verge of collapse as the world around them now seemed, it was anything but. Just the tiniest movement made him feel as though all his strength was being snapped out, and the slower he moved, the more icicles formed along his skin, only slowing him even further. Lionel's dark ice divine armor had stacked with the characteristics of his warping domain divine armor. The latter was a fourth-dimensional divine armor evolved to match a fifth-dimensional one, while the former was the same for the fifth and sixth dimensions. The result was a devastating ability even those well into the sixth dimension could not ignore. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel's palm flipped over, his kinetic spear vanishing to reveal his water domain spear. It looked almost like a trident, its body covered in blue, sapphire-like scales and its head having one very prominent spear blade and two much smaller ones jetting off to the side at an angle. Miguel roared even as Lionel shot into motion once again. The skies cracked, motes of sparkling space falling in all directions. While Lionel himself shot through these falling shards of space as though they were nothing, Miguel was forced to dodge them as they came. Those that managed to touch upon even his force froze it in time, space and functionality, rendering it completely useless. In the moment, it was like only half of Miguel's strength could be deployed, the rest of it being swallowed up by Lionel's dark ice domain. Strength. Miguel swung down meeting Lionel's spear. But behind it he found a relentless, overflowing pressure. It was as though he was facing an ocean's tide. One wave came forth only to recede and for a second to replace it and then a third then a fourth. By the sixth, Miguel's own strength had been completely eroded away, his arm turning numb as he was forced to take a step back. Lionel's spear spun in the palms, a barrage of pierces, sweeps and slices. He chained them all into a combination of lethal strikes. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_ng experience, he could truly feel the essence of the water domain spear. Something within him had clicked. All this time he took up a spear, was flashed with the images of its previous owner, and forcefully grasped its domain. But he had missed something very important. The peak spears that stood at the height of its grade never flashed him with any images of its previous owner. Only the sub-spears that littered the base of its hill did so. Then there was the domain. Was it really something he had comprehended? Not really. Didn't his divine armors come with domains themselves? He didn't have to comprehend his divine armors, the ability just manifested due to its nature. That was when it all snapped into place. The spear domain would exist with or without him. Whoever picked up this spear would be able to use this domain, there was nothing special about him in the slightest. All this time, he had thought that he was ignoring instinct for the sake of gaining a deeper, personal understanding of his spear. He wanted to grasp it on his own, to not have his mind clouded by the comprehensions of others. But in doing so he had been diverted down the wrong path. When Lionel first claimed his duality spear, it fought against him. Anyone would logically conclude that this was because the spear had a soul, but Lionel had conveniently ignored this. It wasn't because he couldn't accept that there were certain things he simply didn't understand yet, but it was rather because he didn't want to lose himself down the rabbit hole such an acceptance would lead him down. While all of Lionel's stubbornness was in one part due to his endless pursuit of logic and understanding, another large part was just his ego. It wasn't just about pursuing logic, but it was also the satisfaction he felt knowing that he had ripped something apart to its bare bones and that it laid out before him, unable to hide any of its secrets from his eyes. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel felt his heart pump, his spear technique becoming faster and more subtle. He had never considered himself to be skilled in the spear. He forcefully integrated comprehensions he gained and sometimes relied on his spear domain lineage factor, but he had always been lacking in something fundamental. Even back when he fought the branch members of the Luxnix family, he still admitted that their raw skill with their weapons was still beyond him despite the fact he defeated them with ease. What was he missing? Why wasn't he a true spear master? Why did wielding his bow and his spear feel so different? Why did one come so naturally while the other moved along so slowly and so awkwardly? It was style. Lionel had never breathed his own life in his spear. Why Star Order had said it quite clearly. Only someone who had their heads flooded with water would think that weapons could have souls. Wasn't it obvious why the domain spears didn't have the memories of previous owners attached to them? It was because Lionel was meant to be the owner. His soul was meant to be their soul. Bang. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscore_undersng experience, a blinding golden light shot up into the skies. Chapter 1244. The golden spear hovering before Lionel's forehead suddenly grew a size. A ring of light formed on either side of it, wrapping around Lionel's helmet and forming a crown with a blinding golden spear as its centerpiece. It and Lionel's bronze halo seemed to resonate, the two vibrating like twin pieces of precious metal. In that moment, Lionel felt as though his eyes had suddenly opened wide. His level 2 spear force trembled. From a neutral white color, it blossomed forth, suddenly becoming sprinkled with flecks soft gold. Lionel's gaze became hazy and unfocused, and yet his assault only grew more powerful. If before it had felt like Lionel's spear was a raging flood dragon, at this moment, it truly became one. Water force bent to Lionel's will without the slightest inclination of resistance. With every pierce, it would fused with Lionel's king's might and his level 2 spear force, forming a roaring eastern dragon that made Miguel feel as though he was being pummeled by a mountain. Miguel sliced down with both his great swords, trying to behead the dragon roaring toward him. But he suddenly found both his blades being rebounded away as though he had just collided with a blade and not two beast constructs. Shirring. Lionel suddenly found that he could only use twice, but he didn't even blink a single eye. His movements flowed seamlessly from one motion to the next. Whereas his spearmanship in the past had felt like a disjointed union of powerful individual moves, his calculative mind and skill seemed to have finally fused into one. Visit. For a better user experience, each attack became like a sacrifice chess piece that set up the next. Each significant strike was like a fork of pieces on the board, one of which Miguel would have no choice but to sacrifice to move forward. Each combination led to another, then another, an endless chain and torrent of barrages that had no sight and end. The beauty of roaring water dragons beneath shattered ice particles of space was too much to describe. It felt as though all those spectating had been transported to another world, only to experience the battle of a deity of ice and water versus a deity of light and darkness. Miguel recovered from Lionel's sudden and enormous leap in strength as only a genius could. His fiendish grin only grew livelier. Come on. Lionel's spear howled, the ring on his finger flickering with an imperceptible glow. Every time it collided with Miguel, a shockwave would travel through the latter's body, jetting out from his back in powerful concentric circles. At the same time, Miguel found his own strikes being severely weakened and sometimes entirely frozen by Lionel's domain, only leaving him susceptible to stronger attacks. Had it not been for his tough elephant skin and its superiority in dimension, he would have long since been littered with holes. And yet, his laughter only became more resounding, his force building up momentum as though it was endless. Bang, bang, bang. Lionel's spear spun, wheels of water following its trajectory. Every time it did, he landed another strike, 3 falling in quick succession. Visit. For a better user experience, Miguel's inner organs finally couldn't seem to take it anymore, his mouth overflowing with a combination of trickling and jetting blood. 3 large dents appeared in his tough skin exterior, Lionel's third blow nearly piercing all the way through and reaching bone. Beneath his mask, Lionel's breath heaved, his face drenched in sweat. He was already nearing his limits before he put on his divine armor, but now he was only approaching them all the more. Even the ice-cool nature of it couldn't seem to stop his body from overheating. As for his innate node, he never thought of using it even once. The Luxnix seemed to believe that it would be in better hands if it was with Miguel. Lionel had no need to prove himself to them as he had the backing of both his mother and wise Star Order. However, with this pride etched deep within his heart, that wasn't nearly enough. That innate node was his own. Whether he cared to use it or not was none of the business of the Luxnix. but right here and now, he would show them just how wrong they were. Lionel pulled back his spear once more, his force surging throughout his body. He squeezed out the last bit of vital star force he had, his gaze lighting up and blooding with such a fierce light that they almost shone through his visor. Lionel poured the last of his strength into his dark ice domain, increasing its strength to the point Miguel was truly frozen in place, shards of what looked like broken glass surrounding his body and his swords to the point he was completely unable to move. The latest _AP_SODIs are on _the website. The miniature humanoid fog of violet rose from Lionel's head, sitting above his spear crown with a lofty air and presence. He wouldn't allow anything in this world to block his path, even if it was himself. The bellow that left Lionel's lips must have been heard all across planet Montex. The will blanketed everything it reached, suffocating the spectators until they seemed to have lost the ability to think any thoughts. Their gazes were all focused on the very same young man. That was, until he seemed to vanish. The separation of Lionel and his spear seemed to have gone up in smoke. Though logically they all felt that there must have been a human behind the supreme strike they were witnessing, their senses told them instead that there was nothing there at all. All that remained was the strike in all its gorgeous beauty. A flood dragon of water, transparent and clear to the point the spear within could be seen. Its scales were outlined by a sharp spear force as the sound of a blade gliding along a whetstone resonated throughout the surroundings. And then it collided with Miguel's torso, landing right upon the very same shallow wound Lionel had caused previously. But at this moment, everything seemed to pause for just a second. Silence fell, space froze, and a hollow, soft wind glided by at a gentle pace. And then, Miguel's touch outer skin was torn to shreds, the spear exiting through a bloodied hole much too large for its slim body. Visit for the best no_vel_it_G experience. Chapter 1245. Lionel's breath came out in heaving swallows. His arm hung out, parallel with his piercing spear, his body not even having the strength to hold his other arm up. Miguel should have been blown backward, but the dark ice domain had forcefully kept him in place, forcing his body to take on the full brunt of the strike and tearing a hole the size of 2 fists all the way through his chest. A wheezing cough left Miguel's lips, his body still being held up by shards of frozen space. Half of Lionel's spear had gone through his body, coating its sapphire scales within a dense mass of thick, flowing blood. Miguel's fiendish grin slowly faded, his gaze meeting Lionel's own. Maybe one day we'll have a real fight, Lionel said through his heavy breath. Miguel didn't say anything in response, his eyes having lost their previous glow and expression going back to how it had always been. It seemed baffling that he had ever been that howling young man from before. But even without more words than that, the two had come to quite a deep understanding of one another. Lionel very much meant the words he had spoken. This Miguel he had defeated was maybe, at best, 20% of what his true strength was. In fact, according to Lionel's estimation, that was an overly positive view. This was probably closer to 10% of Miguel's true strength, most likely less. Visit for the best no_vel_it_G experience on the surface. This seemed ridiculous. But, looking at things from Miguel's perspective, they likely began to make sense. Miguel was an extraordinary talent, this was something that no one could deny. He was born only a few months ahead of Lionel, so their ages were quite negligible, and in another life, they would probably have grown up to be as close as Lionel and James had once been. With the talent he was granted, Miguel had made it to the quasi-6th dimension years ago. However, he didn't have the background to allow him to enter the Void Palace outside of their selections like those from more prominent families could have, so he could only stall in his own progress. That said, this didn't mean that Miguel didn't improve at all. In fact, he had improved almost daily, leaping forward by unfathomable lengths. It was just that it was all reliant on Lionel's innate node. Miguel could gain affinity with practically anything just by eating enough of it, but why would he divert his attention when such a powerful force was within his body? There was no doubt in Lionel's mind that Miguel's comprehension of Scarlet Star Force was several folds beyond him, they couldn't even be compared. When things are looked at from this perspective, you could begin to understand the problem. Miguel's entire battle style and form was predicated on Scarlet Star Force. Even without using the Force itself, just the comprehensions of destruction he had gained and the numerous techniques he had formulated around it would speak for themselves. Much like how Lionel had recently decided to build the foundation of his strength with his Scarlet Star innate node as the foundation, so too had Miguel reached the same conclusion. Except, unlike Lionel, he had the constant guidance of experts, so he had made this logical conclusion much earlier on and had stuck with it. Visit. For a better user experience, the best analogy was that Lionel was battling a fish, and he had suddenly made that fish battle on land instead. The fact Miguel had pushed him to this extent while handicapped in this fashion spoke volumes not only about his talent, but also his deep-seated pride. Lionel doubted that Miguel had even known the innate node within him wasn't his own until recently. Why would the Star Order elders ever tell him such a thing? Even if they ultimately agreed with such a decision, there was no need to run their own names through the mud in the process. Of course, there were probably benefits Miguel had gotten from the Scarlet Star innate node that couldn't be completely divorced from his current battle prowess. For example, he had likely only graduated from the Snowy Star Owl lineage factor so quickly because he could gain the affinity boost from Lionel's innate node. However, Lionel had a feeling that this wouldn't matter much. If he hadn't had the innate node, with the backing of the Luxnix, he could have just been force-fed all sorts of high-level light elemental crystals and pure crystals. By then, the result wouldn't have been as exaggerated, but it would still be comparable. The largest difference would only become more obvious as he left the white stone elephant behind, continued onward. Lionel was even more certain that without his innate node, Miguel would have been able to build his combat prowess with a different foundation, and though he would also be weaker than if he used Scarlet Force, he would still be able to beat the current Lionel. It was almost too obvious. The reason why Miguel's sword swings had all been so simple and wild was purely because all the techniques he had were purposely not used by him. To put things in the most blunt way possible, even now, Lionel could not defeat a full-powered Viola family patriarch. But Miguel had done so in a single strike. Visit. For the best no_underscore_understanding experience, all of this said, this battle was designed to be unfair from the very beginning. Had Miguel hoped to rely on his destructive capabilities, he might have lost even sooner. Lionel's current innate node only hurt him because it had grown too far out of his control. However, the innate node Miguel currently had was at a level where Lionel could not only easily bear it, but he was basically immune to it. Still, Miguel had no idea that Lionel had regrown his innate node already, and he was very much unaware of how Lionel would have countered him easily. No matter how you looked at it, Miguel was an unfortunate loser in this situation. Lionel took a deep breath and began to move, but Miguel had already done so. In a move that stunned those watching, he pierced a hand into his own right hip, ripping out something that shimmered with a blinding red-gold light. He tossed it toward Lionel before the last of his strength wavered and he collapsed. Visit. For the best no_understanding experience. Chapter 1246. Lionel caught the innate node in a hand. Seeing how small it was, he couldn't help but sigh. All of this was caused by a small thing barely the size of a thumbnail. That was right, the innate node within Miguel looked like a piece of a gem one might not even notice by a roadside if it wasn't for the blinding light it was giving off. It was completely unlike Lionel's own, which was so large it had taken over his entire kidney. At a glance, Lionel could tell that while Miguel had been able to adapt, he hadn't been able to do so perfectly. For one, the innate node hadn't grown along with him. Though Lionel wasn't certain if it was meant to grow to the exaggerated size of his own, he was pretty sure that this was far too small. Secondly, the aura that this innate node was giving off was only at the 4th dimension. Miguel was already a step away from the 6th. And yet the innate node he had taken from Lionel had only crossed a single-dimensional barrier in all these years. It was clear and obvious that the transplant wasn't perfect, and if it wasn't for Miguel's ability, it likely wouldn't have shown any progress at all. What was even more obvious was that the help Miguel had gained from this innate node to progress his lineage factor was far less than Lionel had originally assumed. Realizing these things, how could Lionel not feel that things were practically comical at this point? All this commotion for this. At the same time though, Lionel felt an apprehension creep up within his heart. His innate node was actually so powerful that proper comprehension of it had given Miguel so much strength. Lionel suddenly coughed, his divine armor faded away as he fell backward. Visit. For the best no_understanding experience. I'm tired as hell. Lionel was asleep before he even hit the ground. He didn't even register that having lost the support of his spear, Miguel had fallen at the same time. Lionel's eyes opened slowly, finding himself staring at a familiar ceiling. He had been stripped down to his boxers again, though, causing his lip to twitch. I really need to talk to Mom about this. Lionel was in the process of shaking his head when he smelt a familiar scent lingering in the air. That fragrance of apple was undeniable, and it definitely wasn't coming from him. At the same time, he was definitely alone in this room right now, so that could only mean... Damn it. This time, nothing stopped Lionel from shaking his head. Gem? Lionel looked toward his hand to find that his innate node was actually still in his palm. Then again, there were probably very few people who could hold a Scarlet Star Force innate node and not be affected by it. Whoever took it out of him the first time definitely suffered greatly. It was a miracle that Miguel even survived. Visit. For the best no understanding experience, Lionel raised his hand up above his head, taking a good look at the innate node. It didn't seem as bright as it had before and even looked to be quite docile. It hummed with a steady rhythm as though it was feeling content and happy. Lionel didn't know if that was an illusion or if it was real, but it was definitely the feeling he got. Hey old man. Is there any benefit to having 2 innate nodes? Do you take me for an encyclopedia? Despite the discontent in Wise Star Order's voice, he still didn't take long to answer. Yes, that's exactly what I take you for. I'm going to really enjoy killing you one day. Just answer the question. How the hell would I know? Regrowing an innate node is supposed to be impossible, and being born with an innate node at all is an extraordinarily rare event. The only examples I know of individuals being born with 2 were cases where they were born with completely different innate nodes. I've never heard of the same person being born with 2 of the same. So there are people who've been born with 2? The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Yes, there are plenty of people born with far more talent than you arrogant little brat. When did I ever say that I was the most talented person in the world? Sounds like you're projecting, old man. Wise Star Order only snorted in response. I've heard of a child born to the spirituals born with 9. A few of them were common, but 3 of them were true state elements on the same level as yours. Didn't you say spirituals were born without bodies? How could they have innate nodes? Doesn't that mean they just built a body with 9 because they felt like it? I'm living with an idiot. Do you know anything about the body-building process of the spirituals? So why are you drawing conclusions so easily? Plus, do you have any idea of how finicky true state elements are? You can't just take one because you feel like it. Lionel chuckled. He often asked and made a lot of low-level mistakes around Wise Star Order. These were deductions he could easily make himself, but the easiest way to get this old man to talk about what he knows was like this. He called Lionel arrogant, but which of them truly was more so? The old man probably wasn't stupid enough to think that Lionel was so slow, but it could help in the long run regardless. So you're saying if this person had been born a regular human, they would have had 9 innate nodes regardless? That's crazy. Does that mean he had 18 nodes formed in the 3rd dimension? Visit. For the best no _undersing experience, no fool. It's because they were born a spiritual that they could have such talent in the elements. A human would never. Wait, what kind of nonsense did you just say? 18 nodes? Get me out of here, I can't do this anymore. There's only so far you should take this retardation act of yours. Lionel raised an eyebrow. I actually wasn't trying to be stupid there. I have 10 nodes. You have 10 nodes, so Wise Star Order's voice trailed off. What did you just say? Chapter 1247. Lionel raised an eyebrow. This was the first time he had ever heard shock in Wise Star Order's voice. Even when he had been taken off guard by the fact Lionel's innate node had regrown itself, it had been marred by so much pain that it didn't shine through the way that it should have. And, quite frankly, if Wise Star Order had to decide what he was more shocked by, it was definitely this realization. What's wrong with you? What's wrong with me? Wise Star Order didn't even have a witty comeback ready this time. He was caught between wanting to strangle Lionel to death, bashing his head against a wall, and praying to a non-existent god to explain to him if he had already died and entered the gates of hell. Wise Star Order took deep breaths. His murderous thoughts would only end up harming himself. He had become used to controlling his impulses enough that he calmed eventually, shaking his head furiously. Say what you said one more time. I'm hungry, Lionel murmured. Visit. For the best no _undersing experience, he sat up, ready to ignore Wise Star Order to go and deal with that. But he suddenly found a familiar table once again spread with food. However, this time he hadn't been able to smell anything because it was all so perfectly packaged and ready. Lionel blinked and walked over, opening the first container. When the aroma hit him, he felt his legs go weak. This food, it was heaven sent. He had never felt such a strong need to stuff his face until his body imploded. This time he didn't control his impulses, immediately diving in. Just the first bite made his blood lap around his body, surging around at ungodly speeds and making his heart sing. This is so good. You little bastard. Answer my question. You didn't ask a question. Lionel spoke between muffled bites. You stupidly asked me to repeat something you already heard the first time more than clearly enough. What's wrong with you, old man? Have you gone senile already? Star Order's deep breaths got louder. Lionel thought about making a lewd joke, but he eventually refrained. This old man really seemed like he might explode any time now. Visit. For a better user experience, alright. Fine. Where are these supposed 10 nodes of yours? The first is in my brainstem, 2 down my spine, 1 for each of my lungs, 1 in my stomach, 1 for the outflow of blood through my heart, and 1 for the inflow. Finally, there's 1 in my left kidney, and my Scarlet Star Force innate node is in my right kidney. Star Order fell into silence for a very long time, almost as though he had to go and confirm this for himself. Unfortunately, his perception was limited while stuck within the necklace, so he could only vaguely make out that Lionel was indeed telling the truth. But that only floored him all the more. Star Order was a savant, so he had never had to form nodes of his own. Or more accurately, he couldn't. This was the trade-off that came with being granted among the most powerful talent potentials in all of the universe. But that didn't mean he didn't have a strong fundamental understanding. Unlike other savants, Star Order could take over bodies. As such, he had certain methods to circumvent his limitations as a savant. No body he had ever taken over had been in the third dimension, so he had never experienced it personally, but he knew exactly how important the foundation of nodes in the third dimension could become in the future. What? Don't you think that's the perfect setup for nodes? Basically, my entire respiratory system is boosted by force. Unfortunately, after my innate node regrew, I abandoned much of my initial goals for my nodes. Most of my strength comes from either my raw body strength or external force now. Visit. For the best no_understanding experience, what? Yeah. Lionel said absent-mindedly, still devouring container after container of food. Because all of my nodes are connected and work in a feedback loop of sorts, I have to be careful because of my Scarlet Star Force innate node. For example, when I take a breath, oxygen floods my lungs. That process is immediately amplified by my nodes, and it facilitated the diffusion of oxygen into my bloodstream. That blood will make it to my heart and be rushed out by yet another node. Then there's the matter of my kidneys and stomach. My blood is constantly being passively purified, but not as much as it technically could. Together, the system is efficient. But, because of the bottleneck of the weakness of my body, I can't make full use of it. If I let it all go and work like it was meant to, I feel like I would burn up from the inside out. If I wasn't limited like this, I would have probably reached the peak of the Snowy Star Owl lineage factor a long time ago. Star Order found himself taking long breaths again. If he still had a heart and lungs, it would probably be leaping out of his throat right this moment. He really couldn't control himself any longer. If he heard one more nonsensical thing, he might completely explode. Let me get this straight. You formed 10 nodes capable of perfectly supplementing your Boda's strength in every way. But, because you were afraid of a node you were born with as a baby, you put it under lock and key and continued like nothing was wrong? Visit. For the best no_understanding experience, Lionel blinked, pondering for a moment as he swallowed a mouthful of rich soup. He wanted to describe it as liquid gold, but he was certain that gold wasn't anywhere near as appetizing. For a moment he almost forgot to answer the question. Well, it's not exactly like that. It wasn't the innate node I was born with as a baby. It's like 100 times bigger than it was then, and I hadn't had it all my life. That thing's dangerous. I'm gonna kill him. I'm really gonna kill him. Chapter 1248. It took a long time for Star Order to calm down. Or, more accurately, for him to stop writhing under the torture the necklace put him through to force him to calm down. Even after he was heaving for breath for a reason beyond his anger, it still didn't seem to have faded. For as long as he could remember, Star Order had always hated stupid people. This was why his last life was among the hardest to pull off, because he actually had to be nice to idiots. It was a torturous hell all to its own. After his centuries of sacrifice didn't pan out like he wanted, he had reverted to his old self. No, he was even worse. If he hadn't been restrained, he might have really killed Lionel even if it meant never getting the answers he wanted. Do you have any idea how important your nodes are to the foundation of your strength? How is it that you've even survived this long? Well, I have a pretty special magic system backing me. Thanks to my mage core, using atmospheric force is pretty easy. So, ignoring my nodes has always been pretty easy. Lionel's mage core had blossomed into an enormous tree by this point in his ethereal glabella. It was covered in the same 5 colored leaves that had made up the original, but now there was a 6th slowly germinating and rooting itself. It had a radiant blue color and was sometimes misty, sometimes icy, and other times as free-flowing as water. From the very beginning, the mage core represented the true state of Camelot's magic. With it, Lionel didn't need a spiritual medium like a wand or a staff to use magic. As such, ignoring his own nodes had been exceptionally easy. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_ng experience wise star order paused. He had been in Lionel's ethereal glabella before. Of course, he had been distracted by the 7 stars, but there was no way he'd missed the mage core, especially after he had hidden the second half of his soul away. Lionel's mother had a lot of new things he could learn about the mage core and the techniques she had left behind for him. But he had yet to get to them just yet. Do you have any idea what you've been doing to yourself? Lionel laughed. Why don't you just explain instead of tiptoeing around everything so you can have more chances to call me an idiot? Ignoring your own nodes is like trying to breathe with your lungs clipped. It's like trying to speak without a tongue. It's like trying to eat without your fucking stomach. How could you be so stupid? Lionel shook his head. You think I don't realize this is a problem? But what do you want me to do about it? The innate node Miguel took out of him was the size of a thumbnail. Mine is the size of a fist. Do you not understand my dilemma here? Why Star Order was taken aback again. What? It's the size. Fist. It's taken over my whole right kidney. If I don't restrict my nodes, all of my blood would flow through it. If that happens, it'll literally burn from the inside out. You wouldn't even have a chance at taking over my body anymore at that point. Visit. For a better user experience, why Star Order was once again left entirely speechless. An innate node the size of a fist? That was completely unheard of. To put this matter into perspective, the fact Lionel had formed his regular nodes out of 100 cells already placed him at the pinnacle of geniuses. What made innate nodes so special aside from the power of force they held was the fact they were so large to begin with. A fingernail compared to the size of a 100-cell node was astronomical. If you also consider the fact that a 10-cell node was already considered to be quite large, then the fact that most could only form 1-cell nodes, and you'd understand just how exaggerated this matter was. Why Star Order couldn't even begin to wrap his head around what the hell a node the size of a fist represented. In fact, his head felt light and he didn't even want to argue anymore. Explain how you formed your 10 nodes to me. Lionel just gave Why Star Order a casual explanation. He had felt like the only way to reach 100% compatibility with his nodes was to form 10. It was the only way to ensure that he got both his kidneys as that everything would be balanced. After listening, Why Star Order fell into deep silence. Lionel could feel him calculating something, though he felt that his tools were more lacking than his were to do so. Was this how normal people thought? It seemed slow and inefficient. Visit. For a better user experience, though, that conclusion was only considering Why Star Order's raw soul strength. He still computed things faster than Lionel overall, he was just wasting his max potential. But that could only be expected considering he didn't have Lionel's ability nor the higher level Dream Force. I see. By the time Why Star Order had spoke, Lionel was already on his last container of food, the satisfaction he felt not wavering in the slightest. It should be a series of compounding factors. Trying to form both nodes at the same time. Your father's concoctions. The fact that the locations you chose happened to mirror each other perfectly. The fact that one of those locations happened to be the exact location our node had been birthed into in the first place. The fact you were actually stupid enough to try. You really are a lucky bastard to be alive right now. Lionel raised an eyebrow. There's something you're still not telling me. It's not that I'm not telling you, it's that it's far above your pay grade. Why do you think there's a hard cap at 9 nodes? What's regulating the limits? What's stopping people from forming 10, 11, 12, 50 even? You basically stole energy from the regulator of the dimensional verse and used it to do something that should have been impossible. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.